Comic Geek Speak presents Murd's Time Bubble, the 34th time. Buongiorno, Bobelenos. My name is Adam Murdo, and I welcome you to this, the annual event that has become the Time Bubble Podcast. As usual, I need to apologize to all of you loyal listeners out there. I never really intended for this podcast to be produced by me less frequently than my annual Christmas readings. I really wish I could get it to you more regularly. It's nobody's fault but my own. But at least, hey, I have this going for me. At least I didn't allow as large a gap to occur between the last episode and this one as did the episode before that and the last one. I think between the 32nd and 33rd times, we had a gap of something like 17, no, even worse than that. It was more like 19 months. This time it was only 13 or so. So, not too bad. But, you know, you're not tuning into this podcast to listen to me shuffle my feet and mouth apologies to you. You know what this is. You know how often it comes out. And I hope that by now I've conditioned all of you folks out there to just enjoy the show for what it is. You know, take it as it comes. And graciously accept my apologies and empty promises to do better in the spirit in which they are offered. So, I guess one further introductory note for anyone out there who might be listening to this podcast for the first time. This is my own little Comic Geek Speak side project, my little private fiefdom of CGS land, in which I attempt to slog through my own back catalog of reading and share my the chronicles of same with you, the listeners. I'm just a little bit behind in my comics reading, a little bit meaning 15 or more years, and so the basic gist of this podcast is I gather together a good armful of comic books that I purchased a long time ago and have read a slightly less long time ago, and I break them down for you in the hopes of showing you guys the comic book reading world through the subjective lens of my own thoughts and opinions and personal experiences, but also of my subjective locus on the comic book history continuum. Yeah, so I'm seeing things through the eyepiece of 2002 or so, and it's a back issue spotlight basically, where I show you what I was buying circa 2002, what the thought process going behind it, and occasionally some fun little notes of context of deeper history, and also some rather forced time travel metaphors thrown in for good measure, as well as occasionally an even more forced and inconsistently applied idiosyncratic emphasis on the word time. You've heard it a couple of times already in this episode. Just keep your ears open. It's kind of a running gag here. It's very strange. It's not at all necessary. But like everything else I do in this show, hopefully it is a little bit enjoyable. So, let's get down to brass tacks here as I dip into the cargo hold of the time bubble to see which comic books I've got for you first. And I have got a real Bronze Age humdinger for you here to start up this episode. It's a little bit older than the standard advertised fare. It's something older than 2002, in other words. It's taking us all the way back to the 70s. It's actually something that I had been planning to end my previous episode, the 33rd time, with. But then I felt as if I were running over time and also running out of steam, because I don't know if you guys can tell from listening to these episodes I've produced over the years, but they are a little bit exhausting. It takes a lot to just chatter on at top speed the way I tend to do, talking about these comics for 2 or 3 hours on end. So I felt like I needed to pack it in my last episode before I got around to this. But get around to it, I must and will and am, because it's the Mighty Marvel introduction, the Mighty Marvel premiere, in fact, no pun intended, as we'll see, of an idiosyncratic favorite character of mine from decades past. So sit back, hold on to your popcorn, and prepare to hear all about the thricely thrilling, thyroid-throbbing theatrics of 3D Man. And yes, you do have to say it in exactly that tone of voice, with just that level of histrionic vibrato. 3D Man. Yes, like that. And oh, how I delighted to mock this character when I first learned of its existence as a young comic fan of 14 or 15 years old. I don't remember exactly how I first learned that there was a 3D man out there to discover, and probably learned it from Wizard Magazine or something, but my first thoughts on the subject were, after I got done laughing at his rather eccentrically colored costume, shall we say. If you've never seen it, it's kind of divided into motley quadrants of red and alternating red and green, with a pair of goggles to match, with its right lens green, left lens red. It's the significance of which was lost on me at first, as I'll get into that a little more in a minute. But my first thought was that a character with both height, length, and depth, or length, width, and depth, it's not so much a superpower as it is just a basic defining characteristic of human beings everywhere, and really all other forms of organic life known to man. It's being three-dimensional is nothing to boast about. It's not going to help you beat the bad guys in and of itself. You might as well call yourself, like, Captain Carbon-Based, or outrageous oxygen breather. What was lost on me at first, although I did figure it out rather quickly, but was it this character 3D Man was intended to be kind of a personification of the short-lived vogue, fad, really, for 3D cinema that had its first wave in the decade of the 1950s, and that this character also, furthermore, kind of acted as a vehicle for nostalgic revisitation of and commentary on the said decade, the decade of origin of 3D film, the 1950s. And that is really what, at core, what the 3D Man character was meant to be. He's a manifestation of 50s nostalgia, which was running rampant through American culture in the 1970s. Now all of this I didn't quite understand at first, but I quickly got on board with it, and as happened with so many other things that I ridiculed as a jerky teenager, I ended up loving 3D Man, and today I own every one of his appearances. Not that there were that many to track down, but another thing I didn't quite understand at first, or didn't fully appreciate, was not equipped to appreciate as a teenage comic fan, was the creative team that brought the 3D Man to life. And that was none other than Roy Thomas, bringing his signature writing style to bear on this nostalgic tale of the decade that was his teenage years, as he reveals in a text piece in one of these issues. I'm speaking of Marvel Premiere, by the way. The first appearance of 3D Man was Marvel Premiere number 35, which was cover dated April of 1977. And that's why there was no pun intended a little bit ago when I mentioned that we would be talking about the mighty Marvel premiere of this character, because the language was literal. It's not just a Marvel premiere, it's an issue of the comic series, the venerable Marvel tryout anthology of the 70s called Marvel Premiere. So anyway, Roy Thomas wrote the debut of 3D Man, and the pencil art was by Canadian cartoonist Jim Craig, who had also partnered with Roy Thomas to draw the first ever What If story ever published by Marvel, just a couple of months before this. The What If number 1, What If Spider-Man had joined the Fantastic Four. And the inks are provided by Dave Hunt, who turned in some fine work for DC in the first half of the 1980s, most notably, for this reader at least, over the pencils of Kurt Swan in several Superman stories. So he lends 3D Man's Dynamite debut here a real classic superhero look and feel. And the whole mess is presided over by none other than editor Archie Goodwin. Now, if you'd like some background about how the 3D Man strip came to be, I would recommend picking up Back Issue Magazine number 71 someplace from our friends at Tomorrow's Publishing, because that issue is dedicated to anthology series of the 70s. And so there is some talk in there about 3D Man and other fabulous features that ran in Marvel Premiere during that decade. But as I understand it, the bare bones of it is 3D Man was never really meant to be a lead feature. He was supposed to be a backup. story in a triple-sized, of course, triple-sized, what else? 3D magazine that Marvel at one point was planning to publish, featuring Spider-Man, founded on, I guess, nostalgia for the 3D trend, which existed in the very early years of the 1950s. And also as kind of a tip of the cap to the Simon & Kirby project Captain 3D, which ran for one issue from Harvey Comics back in 1953, and which did indeed come with a little pair of 3D glasses, something which Marvel Premiere number 35 definitely lacks. So I guess the 3D experience is somewhat lacking in that respect. But it was originally... The 3D Man concept was supposed to be a backup character for that project that never came about, and... a couple of panels of artwork, which survived to be run as a part of Marvel Premiere number 35, were actually designed to be presented with a 3D effect, which we can't appreciate to its full, the way it was published back in 1977. But anyway, that's more or less where 3D Man came from. But when that magazine was canceled, Roy Thomas, I guess, saw enough value in the concept and just strongly enough desired to pay homage to the 1950s in superhero comics form that he went ahead and pushed through 3D Man as, what else, a three-parter in Marvel Premiere. So we've got issue number 35, and number 36 and 37 are waiting in the wings. I actually own copies of all three, and I'll be talking about each in their turn. I picked up my copy of Marvel Premiere number 35 in January of 2002, which is about the spot in my reading and reviewing that I have naturally reached. I found it at the Route 272 Antiques and Collectibles Marketplace, which is a little consignment mall on Route 272, just to the west of Adamstown, which I've mentioned several times in this podcast as the antiquing capital of the world. Self-described. But this particular mall is really a fine place to go dumpster diving for pop culture media and memorabilia. I've been there many times myself. I actually took Julie Benson there, of the Benson sisters, during her visit to this area several years ago. So on this particular Sunday, I was digging through a big plastic bin, not even a long box, a bin of back issues, just stacked up face up. And I was just digging for treasure. I found this first appearance of 3D Man. I think it was under similar circumstances on a different Sunday visit to this same mall that I found first issue special number 12, the first appearance of the blue-skinned alien Starman, Mikhail Tomas. I think it was even in the same stall. So that's how I got that, and years later, under circumstances now forgotten, I also rounded up the other two parts of this 3D Man three-parter, and... committed what's normally a taboo for me. I don't do it very often, but sometimes I do rearrange the order of comics within my to-be-read pile to put comics that constitute a single story together so that I don't read them, days, months, or years apart. Usually I like to read things in the order in which I buy them, just to preserve the chronology of my my personal comics collecting past. But in the case of this three-parter, I just took the second and third appearances of 3D Man and put them together with the first, and so I am therefore able to review them to you in that order. Anyway, Marvel Premiere number 35. It's got 3D Man jumping right out at the viewer on the front cover. And I'm pretty sure that's one of the images that was originally supposed to be presented in actual 3D, but more's the pity we don't get that experience. So there he is in his red and green motley outfit, also featuring a yellow bolt-studded belt and a big yellow chest emblem resembling three concentric triangles. And the blurb screams, "The action-packed origin of a startling new superhero from the fabulous 1950s." And here we have the introductory little block of text at the top of page 1 of number 35. I read this to you to give you an idea where Roy Thomas is coming from in the launching of this feature. The late 1950s, an era now nearly 2 decades distant in time and space. Remember, this is 1977. Yet an era in which many of the foundations of today's troubled age were laid. It was the time of the first true TV generation. The raucous beginnings of rock and roll. The bombastic rhetoric of the Cold War. James Dean was dead, but Lenny Bruce was alive. Eisenhower was president, but Elvis was king. And today, the second story of a building in downtown Los Angeles in the late 1950s, 1958 to be precise, today it is the hour of the 3D Man. So there you go. That's our intro to this feature. And you'll notice that it talks a lot more about the setting. It's introducing us more to the 1950s than it is to the putative lead character of the feature. So there's your first hint, and it's kind of borne out by the way Roy Thomas writes the rest of this thing, that the setting, the time period, is more important to him than the actual protagonist here. Is setting greater than character as far as 3D Man goes. And then Roy launches us right into the middle of an action sequence as 3D Man beats up a bunch of apparent subversive agents. But in the middle, after he's wiped up all the goons and the ringleader has been cornered, the ringleader undergoes a startling transformation, which triggers a flashback in the mind of 3D Man, which takes us through the rest of most of the rest of this first appearance issue for him. And that flashback, of course, constitutes the origin sequence for 3D Man. And the story of 3D Man, gentle listeners, is the story of two brothers. Not three brothers, mind you. It's oddly enough, or evenly enough, I guess, since two is well, never mind. Two brothers, the Chandler brothers, older brother Chuck and younger brother Hal. Chuck and Hal. And you'll note they're named after two notable, famous test pilots, one real, one fictitious. Chuck as in Chuck Yeager, Hal as in Hal Jordan. There you go. Chuck, the older brother, was a college football hero, and he is a heroic military test pilot, and his younger, teenaged brother Hal is sickly and bespectacled. He suffered from polio, because this is the 1950s, and therefore has to walk with a cane everywhere he goes. He's fragile, and he idolizes his big brother Chuck. The two of them have a thing between them, a little fraternal ritual where Chuck, every time he's going to make a big test flight, he drives Hal out to a specific little rocky formation out in the desert of the American Southwest, where Hal then sits and watches his brother Chuck as he flies around through the sky, and Chuck dips the wings of his planes towards Hal, and Hal waves back, and it's kind of sweet. But then one fateful day, Chuck is commissioned to test fly the military's new stealth fighter, the XF-13. He goes up into the air while Hal is down there in the desert watching, when suddenly Chuck runs afoul of an actual flying saucer up there in midair, and both craft vanish, both from the naked eye of brother Hal down on the ground and from the radar instruments of the astonished military personnel who've been monitoring the flight. Chuck is taken aboard this flying saucer to discover that it's piloted by Skrulls! That's right, the Marvel Universe mainstays. This is proof positive. I mean, Skrulls were really a perfect choice of antagonists for this strip. So big tip of the beret to Roy Thomas for using them, because not only do they ground this 3D Man story of his firmly in the Marvel Universe. This is no alternate reality tale. And not only does it have the interesting wrinkle that Fantastic Four #2 was not the first actual activity of the alien Skrulls, their first attempts to infiltrate or meddle with human society. They've actually been doing it for a couple of decades now, per this story, and a lot of the biggest troublemakers in human history have potentially been, if they haven't been Skrulls all along, the Skrulls have at least from time to time impersonated them in order to accomplish their sinister ends among humankind. So perfect in that respect, and they're also a perfect choice of villain for a story that seeks to metaphorize some of the features of the 1950s. Roy is pretty plain in his text piece, which ran in the second of the three chapters of this 3D Man story, issue number 36 of Marvel Premiere. He comes out and says, "Oh yes, if you think the dialogue and point in this story is just a reiteration of Cold War rhetoric, us versus the commies, then you didn't read it very carefully. Better luck the second time." No, I think what Roy is going for here is it's more of a critical examination of the less fondly and nostalgically remembered features of the decade, shall we say, and an attempt to, I don't know, make a fantasy apology for them by writing them off to Skrull interference. Just Cold War paranoia, McCarthyism, societal conformity and persecution of those who don't fit in. You can chalk them all up to the activity of Skrull subversives, because, as was revealed in the Kree-Skrull War storyline in Avengers in the late 60s, also written by Roy Thomas, both the Kree and the Skrull, alien races, became aware at some point that human beings, once they became capable of space travel and penetrate out into the outer galaxy and the cosmos beyond, have the potential to cause a great deal of trouble for the galactic powers that be, including the Kree and Skrull empires, which is one reason why the Kree and Skrull keep showing up on Earth and causing trouble. So here's, just to further that established fact, we have the Skrulls here in the 1950s United States trying to do everything in their power to, well, in their own words, retard the advance of humanity and prevent them from getting into outer space. So, this was kind of an important moment for the Skrulls, because in the 1950s, 1958 again to be precise, humankind was getting dangerously close to getting outside of their own atmosphere. So the Skrulls felt the need to act, however subtly. After capturing Chuck Chandler, they revealed to him that they've captured several other pilots like him, and they vaporized them all, but he's special. For reasons not really revealed here. Did they catch their limit or something? I don't know. But they decide that instead of killing him, they're just going to brainwash him and let him go. Catch and release. But before they get the chance to do that, Chuck, two-fisted, lantern-jawed, all-American hero that he is, punches a couple of aliens in the face, escapes from their clutches, and runs back to the XF-13, jumps inside. Along the way, he manages to damage an unstable Skrull energy generator. It overloads, and it explodes, just destroying the Skrull saucer, as Chuck barely gets away, but he's bathed in alien radiation, just your standard Marvel Universe magic. And he manages to touch down in the desert, not far away from where his brother Hal is waiting for him. And he runs across the desert, beginning to emit an eerie glow as he goes. He stretches out his hand towards his brother Hal and cries his name, and then in a flash he disappears, knocking poor Hal over. And when Hal comes to, he finds an eerie after-image left on the lenses of the eyeglasses he was wearing, one red and one green, matching two-dimensional images of his brother Chuck, all that appear to be left of dear brother Chuck. But then Hal puts on these glasses. He focuses his eyes on the two red and green images on either lens, and kind of, as he focuses on them and allows the two of them to come into focus into a single three-dimensional image, those images leap from the lenses of the glasses, reform into a dichromatic and superhumanly powerful reincarnation of sorts of the late Chuck Chandler. His psyche is intact. He now has superhuman powers. But while he does this, though, while he returns to life, Hal collapses on the ground, lifeless. So in it, kind of like Doctor Strange's body whenever he astral projects. And I think it's kind of a similar phenomenon. Just putting on my nerd cap here and hypothesizing, I think it's probably that Hal is projecting his own life force through those glasses in order to, reinflate, so to speak, his poor brother and bring him back to superhuman life. And so the 3D man was born, and he takes it upon himself to go out there and hunt down those alien crumb buns that are responsible to reducing him to this miserable half-life as a pair of red and green images etched into his little brother's eyeglasses. It's really kind of horrific when you think about it. And so that's what... That brings us full circle here, because you guessed it, the ringleader of the subversives, the 3D man, was fighting at the beginning of the story. He turns out to be a Skrull agent, and he taunts 3D man with the knowledge that, hey, we're already among you. We we've infiltrated all the houses and seats of power in your world. We're going to keep you rooted here on your miserable little rock of a planet no matter what. And 3D Man attacks him again. The scroll falls out of a window and into a crowd below, immediately assuming the form of a normal human and slips away. And that's where the first issue ends. But with one further wrinkle, the 3D Man then feels compelled. He feels drawn back towards the suburban Los Angeles home where Brother Hal is waiting. And he runs back there because this power and this second chance at life that Chuck Chandler has gained comes at a price. He's only able to enjoy said power and life for 3 hours at a time. It's kind of a Rex Tyler-esque time limit to this second lease on life. And when the 3 hours are up, he feels pulled back to wherever Hal has left his comatose form, and he is forced to split back into 2 tiny images of himself and re-imprint himself onto Hal's glasses until the next time. And then Hal reawakens and laments anew the tragic circumstances that have given 1950s America its new defender. So there's number 35. Number 36 continues Roy Thomas's surfing the wave of 50s nostalgia in the 70s as only he can. It's a story called The Devil's Music, in which the 3D Man... It opens with a pretty blatant riff on the motorcycle moral panic film The Wild One, in which a 3D Man fights a bunch of generic biker thugs who are trying to steal secret scientific papers from a generic professor. And the Marlon Brando-esque leader of this gang turns out to be a Skrull! And so 3D Man chases him off. And then later on, Hal Chandler feels kind of an instinctive, spider sense-like impulse to go see a concert of an obvious Elvis analog, a rockabilly musician named Vince Rivers, who's playing to packed houses of teenagers. And so something about Rivers seems a little bit off to Hal. So trusting his instincts, he goes to the concert. Rivers starts playing, and a riot breaks out among the young people in attendance. For some reason, Hal is unaffected. And also all the other people above the age of 20 are unaffected. Eventually, it's revealed that there are actually Skrullian devices hidden in the amps at this concert, that they're aggression amplifiers that are only effective on adolescents somehow. And Vince Rivers turns out to be human, an unwitting pawn of a well-known nationwide DJ and concert impresario who turns out to be a Skrull! So yes, those aggression devices were all just... Yeah, that's another Skrull plot. And then in the third installment of 3 of this introduction to the world of the 3D Man, it's a story called Codename The Cold Warrior, and it features 3D Man going up against a Skrull-empowered agent. This time, the ringleader of the Skrulls, who's gone up against Chuck Chandler as 3D Man a few times now. He's identified by name as Xerxu in this story. He assumes the identity of United States Vice President Richard M. Nixon, and pays a visit to a Los Angeles-based, highly disgruntled scientist and inventor, a Professor Sivorsky, who has a fanatical hatred of communists in the Soviet Union because he is the son of immigrants to the United States who were run out of their homeland by Soviet expansion. And he's working on a process to endow a human body with superhuman powers by exposing it to controlled extremes of cold. So Richard Nixon shows up in person to help this scientist work his devices, and probably slipping some Skrull-built widgets into the works in the process to make sure that the process works the way the good doctor plans it to. And Dr. Sivorsky then converts himself in this chamber into a cryonically empowered super being with kind of the generic starter package of superpowers, super strength, super speed, etc., plus cryonic cold blasts. And he's Nixon, quote-unquote, himself, codenames this guy the Cold Warrior. He assures him that 3D Man is in fact a communist agent. He tells him, his costume may be only half red, but I assure you his politics are entirely so. And so, thusly enraged, the Cold Warrior sets out to do battle with the 3D man, finds him on the piers outside of Los Angeles, which is where most of these 3 issues worth of events take place, by the way, in the Los Angeles area, which was home to Roy Thomas for a good period of time. 3D Man battles the Cold Warrior and defeats him by knocking him off a pier and into the water, which shorts out his super suit and neutralizes his cryogenically derived superpowers. So he sputters to the surface, floundering and cursing like a sailor, and that's basically the end of that. The 3D Man runs off. Significant detail of issue number 37's story is that Thomas begins fiddling with his 3D Man formula already before the 3-issue tryout is already finished. He's already tinkering with the rules of the strip, which is usually not a sign that things are going well. He writes something into the story where 3D Man is hit by a random Skrull energy blast just before he recedes into Hal's glasses. So that the next time Hal puts the glasses on, it's Hal's psyche that is the dominant. And poor Christmas-colored super golem Chuck is nowhere to be seen. And Hal, meanwhile, so he gets to play the hero. You know, his human body left behind, and this red and green superhuman energy doppelganger of his brother is then inhabited by his mind, and he gets to jump around and play the hero, and he's barely wondering what's become of Chuck. Although at the end of the story, Roy does throw in a line of narrative dialogue about how the story is written mostly in the second person, distinctively enough. He writes a line about how Hal begins to wonder if his brother's personality is gone forever. And meanwhile, the Skrull Nixon wanders into the shadows, thinking to himself that he'll probably never have need to assume the identity of Nixon again after this. Or will he? Yeah. So, yeah, that's more or less what goes on in the 3 issues of this 3D Man tryout. It occurs to me that I haven't mentioned yet what exactly 3D Man's power set is. Well, first of all, he is, in fact, 3-dimensional, in physical form, at least. It's kind of ironic for a character called the 3D Man, but old Chuck's personality does come off as kind of flat. I wonder if the irony of that was lost on Roy himself. But, yeah, for as much as I initially mocked this character when I first learned of it back in my teenage years for treating having 3 dimensions as a superpower, having read the story and putting myself in poor Chuck Chandler's shoes, having to exist in the form of a pair of tiny, immobile, 2D candy-colored images etched on my little brother's glasses most of the time, until the brother puts those glasses on and infuses the images with his life essence. And if I had to go through that and was only able to live life 3 hours at a time at my brother's sole whim and discretion, I think if I had to live through that, suddenly becoming 3-dimensional again would actually seem like something of a superpower. But in addition to that, Chuck had some other things going for him. Or Hal in issue number 37, whichever Chandler brother happens to be in control of the 3D Man's body at a given time. That body has pretty much 3 times all the physical potencies, skills, and characteristics of a normal human body put together. He's 3 times as strong, 3 times as fast, 3 times as agile. He can shout 3 times as loudly. He can hear 3 times as acutely. I bet you his jokes are even 3 times as funny, because he's got super humor. No, yeah, but basically, you name it, he can do it 3 times as well as the average human being can, which certainly does have its uses. And in addition to that, he seems to have scraped together, as a result of the nature of his origin involving Skrull technology, he seems to have developed a kind of Skrullo sense. He develops kind of a tingling awareness when Skrulls are near. He can't do kind of a they live thing where he sees through their shape-changing deceptions. But he can't tell when he's talking to a Skrull exactly, but he knows when there's a Skrull nearby at least, and he was able to track them down that way. So thus runs the early glory days of the 3D man character, in a very tight nutshell. Yeah, so it's Roy Thomas's little paean to the decade of his adolescence, and it's a chance to do his own little American graffiti type story, but in strictly superheroic terms. Actually, just for the fun of it, I would like to share a quotation from Isaac Asimov, no less, quoted by Roy Thomas in his little authorial editorial about 3D Man in the middle of issue number 36 of Marvel Premiere. To anyone who has lived a life that has not been utterly disastrous, there is an iridescent aura permeating life's second decade. Memories of the first decade, extending back to before the age of 10, are dim, uncertain, and incomplete. Beginning with the third decade, after 20, life becomes filled with adult responsibility and turns to lead. But that second decade, from 10 to 20, is gold. It is in those years that we remember bliss. Thus, the 3D Man. So yeah, that's what draws Roy Thomas, or drew him in 1977, I should say, to create a character of this kind as a kind of a superheroic exploration of the decade during which Roy Thomas experienced all of that, those golden days of adolescence. And he pipes in as many, cultural references to 1950s things as he can, although I will say that I don't feel it's quite as well researched or as carefully executed as, say, his work on The Invaders, or even later, the All-Star Squadron for DC. And in fairness, this is something that he had kind of a busy schedule going on in the late 70s, and this was something that was never meant to be a lead feature, as I've mentioned before. It was just going to be a little brief backup story in that big 3D Spider-Man magazine Marvel was planning to publish and then axed. So Roy probably blew the story up to triple issue length from one backup story in kind of a hurry. So it's vintage Thomas, but it's maybe not Thomas at his best. It's not the best idea he's ever had, but it's a cool idea, and I'm glad that there's a 3D man out there for people to enjoy, to ridicule, whose name to say in a funny voice, 3D man, all of that. It's nice to just walk this little bridge, back to 2002, and thence back to 1977, and thence back to 1958, with Roy Thomas as guide and docent. But the story of the 3D Man does not end there. I mean, let's not forget that 3D Man, after this, in 1978, became a founding member of the 50s Avengers. That in the story that ran in What If number 9. What if the Avengers formed during the 1950s? So 3D Man was the sole latter-day, post-1950s retro insertion into Marvel 50s superhero lore to be a part of that. It was him and 4 other actual period-authentic Marvel/Atlas publications, superhero characters that were thrown together in that team. And that was kind of originated by Roy. Right? He didn't actually write the story. He gave some input into it, but the script was actually written by occasional Roy assistant and protege Don Glutt, who also filled in for him on a couple of issues of The Invaders. So that story, which is a favorite of mine, it was Roy Thomas's way of enshrining his own creation, his own period invention of 3D Man in amongst other authentic 50s Atlas characters. And then, jumping ahead still further to another comic that I actually have in front of me right now. This is a selection from my storied Diefenbach's collection, which is just a bunch of comics from circa 1980-81 that my dad had picked up for me at a yard sale back in the 90s sometime. And these were comics that were kept in an old potato chip box, Diefenbach's potato chips, hence the Diefenbach's collection. It contains runs of a year or two's worth of a few Marvel flagship titles, The Avengers, Fantastic Four, and The Incredible Hulk, and a couple of others. And included in that collection, and in those runs in that potato chip box, is The Incredible Hulk number 251. And the cover blurb to that story asks the question, whatever happened to the 3D Man? So, yes, this story is cover dated September of 1980, exactly 3 years after Marvel Premiere number 37, the end of his own little solo run there in Marvel Premiere. So exactly 3 years real time have passed, but the story jumps us forward to the present day. So the 1950s are well behind us. We learn in this issue, as Bruce Banner We join him in medias res here. The story, by the way, is written by Bill Mantlo, a part of his underrated run on the Hulk in the early 80s, with art by Sal Buscema. Bruce Banner wanders into the backyard of Hal Chandler in Los Alamos, New Mexico, which was Bruce's old stomping grounds, after all. And we learn here, as Bruce sits down to dinner with the Chandler family, who catch him rooting through their garbage and invite him inside and give him a hot meal. We learn that Hal, eventually, after a couple of other unrecorded adventures with his brother as 3D Man, apparently Chuck's psyche did resurface a little bit later on. So that thing in number 37 where Hal animated the 3D Man himself, that didn't last. So they had a couple of other adventures as 3D Man, and then Hal finally put the glasses away forever, decided to just live his own life. And he married Peggy, who was Chuck Chandler's girlfriend, who was a supporting character in the 3-issue run and Marvel premiere for 3D Man as well. So they got married, they moved to Los Alamos, and they had 2 kids named Hal Jr. and Chuck Jr. They have this happy family here, and Bruce comes in the middle of it, and they invite him to stay the night. But then we discover that Hal has recognized Bruce as the alter ego of the Hulk, and fearing for his family's safety, he picks up the phone, calls the authorities, and then he goes up to his bedroom, gets out those fateful eyeglasses that he's dreaded putting on after all these years. Mantlo suggests in his script that Hal has been plagued by guilt over what happened to Chuck, and also guilt over having, basically, in a couple of different ways, stepped into Chuck's life. After that life was taken away from Chuck by this bizarre radiation mishap that reduced him to 2 little red and green images. Hal then swoops in and steals his girlfriend, marries her, and starts a family, and he feels guilty about that, and that's one reason why he hasn't called on 3D Man in all these years, but he does, for the sake of the safety of his family. He summons 3D Man. Hal slumps inert in a chair, and Chuck Chandler lives again as the 3D Man. He gets into a fist fight with the Hulk because he tries to disturb Bruce in his sleep and overpower him that way. But Bruce hulks out, and 3D Man versus the Hulk. That's the marquee fight of Incredible Hulk number 251. And long-time Marvel fans will know that during the late Bronze Age, the Hulk developed this adorable habit of assigning kind of a cute little half-witted pet name, a Hulk-pokerism, if you will, to various characters he encountered. His Defenders teammates Namor the Submariner and Nighthawk, for example, were Fishman and Birdnose to him. So the pet name he assigns to 3D Man is Fancy Man, which is just great. So the Hulk and Fancy Man get into it and knock a couple of holes in the Chandler's house in the course of their brawl, until finally little Chuck Jr. intercedes on Hulk's behalf, and he's figured out somehow that the 3D Man is actually the resurrection of his uncle Chuck, his dad's older brother, who supposedly died in a plane crash back in 1958. And so he speaks up for Hulk, and he also gives Hulk a piece of important information. Rick Jones is in trouble, because he is. In kind of an interlude scene earlier in the issue, Rick and some of his friends are cornered by Wood God, another Bronze Age Bill Mantlo creation, co-created by Keith Giffen, incidentally. He's kind of like a genetically created satyr, and he's seeking his place in the world, and he thinks he's found it with a bunch of human-animal hybrids called the Changelings. He mistakenly believes that Rick and Doc Samson are threatening their little changeling colony, so he menaces Rick, and Rick gets on a ham radio that happens to be nearby, and puts out the first call he's made in years to his old allies in the Teen Brigade, Marvel Silver Age concept that hasn't gotten that much play. Although I think Al Ewing used them in Immortal Hulk. I'm not sure. I haven't read up that far. Anyway, very few members of the Teen Brigade remain active, as it turns out, so almost no one hears this emergency distress call. although that distress call does lead directly to the creation of the Southwestern team of superheroes called the Rangers, which will appear just a few issues after this. But anyway, Chuck Chandler Jr. does receive the call, and he tells Hulk, hey, stop fighting my uncle, the 3D man. We forgive you for being what you are. You're not trying to hurt anybody. You were a guest in our house. This should never have happened. Please go away and help your friend Rick. And Hulk does. And so all's well, and that ends well. Chuck, the 3D man, returns to the glasses, and finally Peggy learns the truth about her former love, Chuck, and all the things that Hal has been keeping from her all these years. But as it turns out, it does not destroy the marriage or the family. It brings them only closer together, because now Peggy knows that Chuck is potentially still alive, and so now she has both Chandler brothers back in her life. Although Chuck, as he goes back into the glasses and becomes the two tiny images again, he thinks to himself, forget about me, brother. I died back in the 50s. Let's just let it stay that way. So it's a little bit poignant there. So there's your whatever happened to the 3D man story to kind of wrap up this trilogy in 4 parts, as it were. Not counting the what-if story I mentioned. It's the Ballad of the 3D Man. So, yeah, it's not the best-known Marvel character, and it's one that I always thought was rather silly, and rightly so, because it is rather silly, but it's kind of a great kind of silly. It's colorful, it's nostalgic, it actually has something to say about the time period in which his adventures were set. So, he's not such a throwaway character after all. He's an important part of Marvel lore, I think. And those of you who are readers of the Kurt Busiek and George Perez run on the Avengers in the late 90s, early 2000s, which was praised highly by us at CGS in our recent Top 5 George Perez Projects podcast episode. Listen to it if you haven't yet. If you're any kind of George Perez and his work, and you probably are if you're a fan of comics. We mentioned that run by Busiek and Perez, and part of that run was a return of Peggy Chandler and the 3D man concept, because Busiek and Perez introduced a character called Triathlon, alias Delroy Garrett Jr., who became a member of the Avengers, and it was revealed that there was a connection between 3D man and Triathlon, that their origins were linked, and that together they constituted kind of a cosmic antigen created by the universe to help battle an extra-dimensional triple evil that showed up. So there's more to it than that, of course. I'm glossing over it pretty heavily, but just go back and read or reread, or read for the first time, if you haven't had the pleasure yet, the Busiek-Perez run, if you want to see how the concept of 3D man is advanced. And in fact, Delroy Garrett Jr. eventually graduates from Triathlon to become the new 3D man during the Secret Invasion storyline, which involves those pesky Skrulls, and which I guess kind of builds on, distantly, certain base concepts introduced in the 3D man run in Marvel Premiere by Roy Thomas, in that he establishes that the Skrulls have been infiltrating human society on several levels for decades, and that all kind of comes to a head in the Secret Invasion story. So there you go, 3D man. Love it or lump it. It's cool 3 times cool. It's a Marvel concept that really flips my kitsch switch. Oh, and one final note about Marvel Premiere number 35, part 1 of 3. I do like to sometimes note on retro advertising I find in some of these older comics, because they can be an interesting cultural time capsule and just kind of a hoot in their own right. A bit of irony, you might call it, in number 35, page 18. There's an ad for something called The Adventures of Hollow Man. Yeah, that's HOLO as in hologram, not HOLLOW. I don't know. It's the character might be hollow and he might be dead inside, or he might just have no internal worth. I don't know. But anyway, it's an ad for a little something published by Atomic Comics of Newark, New Jersey, and it's a little holographic 3D pendant, 1 3/4 inches across, an Amazing Adventures of Hollow Man comic book, and a 45 RPM action record. So it's a pretty appropriate thing to appear in the pages of the first appearance of 3D Man, because 3D Man is a superhero based on an old stereoptic cinematic gimmick, and Hollow Man is a new superhero character based on a more recently developed optic gimmick, holography. So, there you go. Fun little bit of serendipity there. Sort of thing I do like to mention on the Time Bubble, and just 3D Man in general. He's a comic book that I purchased in 2002, was published in 1977, and is set in 1958. Talking about this comic is like a triple trip back in time, and that in and of itself makes it, as I hope you'll agree, a perfect candidate for discussion here aboard the Time Bubble. Now, for our next selection, we'll need to venture even a little bit further into the past than 1977. In fact, we'll need to go beyond the far pale of the 1970s, back to that tremendously turbulent, sublimely psychedelic year, 1969. And once there, we're going to be talking about a DC comic. And not just any DC comic, but an issue of that Cadillac of Silver Age tryout anthologies, Showcase. Specifically, I have here in my hand issue number 82 of Showcase, cover dated May of 1969. Picked up my copy of this book under pretty much the same circumstances as I did my copy of Marvel Premiere number 35 with the first 3D Man at one of the many antique malls that line the same stretch of road where I bought the aforementioned Marvel Premiere issue, only one a few miles further to the east. And it's a shop that's a good bit older, dingier, and more severe of aspect than the Route 272 Antiques and Collectibles Marketplace. Now, that place is just a big, messy, fluorescent-lit, indoor, multi-family rummage sale. This other place, I don't even know the name of it. It takes itself and its wares a bit more seriously. It reminds me a little more of a Dickensian curiosity shop. And my father and I, back in the days when we used to go out and scavenge for old things along Route 272, we didn't stop in at that place very often. But one drizzly Sunday afternoon, early in 2002, I'm not sure it was the same day as I found the first 3D Man, but it couldn't have been too many weeks apart from it. We stopped in there and found just a handful of old DC comics that I thought were worth having, and one of them happened to be Showcase number 82. I actually see here that I paid $4 for it. And, so this is an issue that kind of marks, in a way, the beginning of the end, for this grand old tryout book. The comic that arguably gave birth to the Silver Age of comics when it introduced Barry Allen, The Flash, back in 1956. But by 1969, its heyday was pretty safely behind it. It was on the decline. As a matter of fact, counting down from number 82 to the to issue number 93. It had about a year left in it. Not counting its revival in the late 70s when DC got another year worth of issues out of it, which gave the world the new Doom Patrol and the first solo Adventures of Power Girl, to name a couple. But here in the last year of the original uninterrupted run of Showcase, this is the beginning of the last year of that initial uninterrupted run. And that year consisted of 4 different 3-issue trial runs, or auditions for new features, if you will. And those were Fire Hair, which was the story of a red-haired white child having been adopted and raised by Plains Indians in the Old West. Jason's Quest, which is the story of a young motorcycle-riding, troubled 60s youth going on a quest to try to find his missing sister. A space thriller called Manhunter 2070. That's actually the swan song, the last act on the bill for Showcase, which saw print in 1970. And the first of these, the one that I'm actually going to be talking about here, is a 3-issue run beginning in number 82, which is the introduction of the character Nightmaster. Yes, a character that those of you who've heard of him, if you have in fact heard of him, you've probably First got to know him during the Shadow Pact, his involvement in the Shadow Pact super team, which spun out of Infinite Crisis, back in 2006 or so. Or perhaps, if you're like me, a connoisseur of DC's Who's Who series of character handbooks, you may remember the full-page entry he got in Who's Who, despite the fact that he had made very few appearances outside of his 3-issue run here in Showcase in 1969. I'm pretty sure Neil Gaiman name-checked him in the Books of Magic in the latter 80s. But, yeah. Anyway, so yes, the Nightmaster has been brought to light here in a story that, well, quoting from the credits box on the title page here, is something more than a story, written and created by Denny O'Neil, visually interpreted by Jerry Grandanetti on pencils and Dick Giordano on inks. And the whole thing is edited and presided over by that old DC warhorse Murray Boltinoff. I'm going to dwell for a moment here on the front cover, which is drawn by another DC legend, Joe Kubert, and it features Nightmaster in his costume, which is kind of a head-to-toe blue bodysuit, minus gloves, but plus a blue cowl over his head, with a red cloak and a belt with a large letter N as a buckle, and he's wielding his trademark weapon, the Sword of Night. Behind him is his damsel in distress, his girlfriend Janet Jones, and Nightmaster is engaged in battle with a small group of evil warlocks, wielding flaming spears against him. And in the background, of course, is the tableau of the night sky, with a castle looming ominously off in the right-hand side of the background. The trade dress is kind of interesting here because it's the beginning of a new look for Showcase that would last it all the way to the end of its initial run, a year later. The DC Bullet, it's the old Silver Age one that many of you are probably familiar with. It's the one that has Superman on the top and National Comics on the bottom, just a circle within a circle, and those words inside the outer circle, and just the letters DC in the middle of it. That's still up there, visible in the upper left-hand corner of the cover. But just below it, and a little bit to the right, is an enormous in proportion to a comic book cover, but it's 2 1/4 inches across, or in diameter. It's a huge red sunburst with the letters DC up in about 1.5 inches high each. So this is 1969. This is marking kind of a period of cover design experimentation for DC, when DC kind of lacked, and deliberately so, a cohesive and consistent identity across the covers and the logos on its covers for a little while here. It began in 69 and lasted the first year or two of the early 70s. But yeah, it was a time of experimentation when nearly every DC title, or like family or genre of titles, had its own unique variation on the DC logo. Like some of the horror titles would have like a bat shape with a DC, little letters DC inside of it. It's like every title or family of titles had its own little variant take on that idea. And Showcase's answer to that is to just emblazon the DC letters in the middle of this gigantic helic orb up in the upper left, right underneath the more traditional bullet. Down the left-hand spine, we see the letters Showcase arrayed vertically. The 12-cent cover price is in between the sunburst and those letters. And over to the right side of the top, we see the words Preview Showcase. So I guess kind of an unofficial variant title of Showcase for a couple of issues here. The ones featuring Nightmaster was DC Preview Showcase. Not exactly a preview of anything in this case, because Nightmaster didn't make any more appearances in DC Comics for a while after his 3-issue run here. But anyway. And then one of the more important things here that'll help me segue into the content of the issue. Down at the bottom is a blurb reading, "Beginning a great new sword and sorcery saga." And this Nightmaster tale is a relatively early entry in the sword and sorcery genre, the so-called, in comic books. I mean, there had been other stories that could arguably be described as sword and sorcery stories appearing in comics before this, of course. But this might be, and don't quote me on this, I have nothing to back this up. I'd be more than happy to be corrected by those better in the know, but this might be one of the first comic book stories to self-consciously describe itself as sword and sorcery, because Although the genre we know today as sword and sorcery fiction had been around for a couple of decades by 1969, the term sword and sorcery was still fairly newly minted by then, having been coined by one of the early contributors to the genre, Fritz Leiber, or Lieber, I'm not really sure which. It's Leiber. If I've got it wrong there, I'll more than happily put a quarter in the jar. I'm going with Leiber, though. He apparently coined that term back in 1962, so Wikipedia tells me. And here we are in 69, and here's a comic book story billing itself, advertising itself as sword and sorcery content. So that's a little bit of something special. This is something that its creators clearly wanted to succeed and to be a good PR for the genre in comics going forward. The results, as you'll see, are a little bit mixed. But turning the cover over and going to the first page, we see a wonderful phantasmagoria of surrealistic imagery here, presented by penciler Jerry Grandanetti. The title of the story is Some Forbidden Fate. And on this first page, we join our hero protagonist, musician Jim Rook, the man who would be the Nightmaster, as he finds himself shifted into this surrealistic, otherworldly landscape. And the narrative voice picks up here. This is something that this story actually has in common with 3D Man, is that it's a 3-issue tryout in an anthology title, and also it's told in second-person narrative voice. The first line here is, "You do not understand it, do you, Jim Rook? You do not understand how you came to be in this terrifying, unearthly place." So yeah, so the second-person narrative voice is something that was used fairly often, I think, around this time, like the late 60s, early 70s, as a way to try to get the comic book reader invested in and identified with the main character by phrasing everything as you. Just like the narrator, the omniscient narrator is addressing both reader and main character as you. And so you'll find that in a lot of the horror comics of the period, too. And clearly this couldn't possibly have been Denny O'Neil's intention here, but reading this from a far future vantage point, I can't help but be reminded of a dungeon master talking to his players in the second person as I read this story. Well, it just adds to the trip factor a little bit. So anyway, let's begin mighty Murdo synopsis here. So that first page kind of throws us and Jim Rook in medias res, but then immediately on page 2, we jump a little bit back in time to where Jim Rook was before he found himself in this way out situation. And it turns out that Jim Rook, as a musician, he was playing in an intimate little concert venue known as the Electric Band-Aid in the East Village. He and his band, the Electrics. Yeah, really imaginative name there. But then again, they're in this story for all of a single panel, so, why waste the creative energies there? He's playing a show for a sold-out house. It goes well. He gets away from the screaming teeny bopper fans and slips away to his dressing room where his girlfriend Janet Jones is awaiting him. And they're just about to celebrate a successful performance together, as only two lovers can, when a knock comes at the dressing room door. Jim goes over to get rid of whoever's there, and in step 3 generic roughnecks just sent over from Central Casting, who for no particular reason have decided to come backstage, find the front man for this band they've just seen play, and heckle him to his face. One of them even goes so far as to throw several homophobic remarks Jim's way. And this immediately leads to Jim getting into a Donnybrook with these 3 generic backstage bullies, and during which he delivers he lets them have it verbally and just gives vent to his pent-up feelings of frustration being a peace-loving, countercultural young person in the midst of the 60s, and how he's tired of all the mainstream culture giving him grief for being the way he is. And you can tell that it's kind of a cathartic little sequence for Denny O'Neil, and for counterculture types across the country. So once Jim has dispatched these people, the moment has been ruined for him and Janet. And besides, police sirens can be heard in the background. It's amazing how police can get wind of things like this so quickly in action fiction stories. Jim and Janet then hit the street. They walk out the streets of the East Village, and they come across a storefront that they don't think they've seen before. The window reads Oblivion Inc. And so Jim and Janet, on a whim, decide to engage in a little bit of light breaking and entering. They go inside of the Oblivion Inc. storefront when suddenly the door slams shut behind them, and all the sights and sounds and light of city life outside fade into darkness and silence. And out of this darkness lash out tendrils of mysterious eldritch energy, which ensnare the two lovers and drag them across time and space. The two get separated in the void, and when Jim touches down, he finds himself in that surrealistic landscape I mentioned on page 1. He wonders aloud, "Where am I?" And a small clutch of strange, diminutive, dwarfish, blue-skinned people standing nearby. A little bit MGM Munchkins and a little bit Owens, actually. They don't look unlike the Guardians of the Universe. Snickeringly inform him that he is in the magical realm of Myrrha. M-Y-R-R-A. Myrrha, which is, you may notice, a near homophone for mirror, M-I-R-R-O-R, as in holding up a funhouse mirror to reality, as in through the looking glass and what Alice found there. You get it? Got it. Good. Okay, so he's in Myrrha, and he walks a few steps when he comes upon a welcoming party of one in the person of King Zolto of the land of Myrrha. Note also that the first two letters of Zolto, Z-O, are Oz, O-Z, spelled backwards. Another reference there to the kind of story that this story is loosely based upon. King Zolto informs Jim that he's the one who brought Jim here for a specific reason. He hands Jim a magic exposition gemstone that recites to him a tale of old, of Jim's distant ancestor, who apparently was born in the land of Myrrha, back in the days when the inhabitants of Myrrha looked more like typical Earth human beings and less like little blue-skinned dwarves. The gemstone tells him that long ago, Jim's ancestor, Nacht, and the noble warrior Nacht and his colleague, the barbarian warrior Brom, were called before the king of Myrrha, whom both were pledged to serve, and the king's royal wizard, Farben. Farben is German for colors, by the way. I don't know if it's important, but just in case it is, you've been warned. And he has been told by the king to enchant the weapons of both Nacht and Brom, that they may better serve the land. And so that's how Nacht came into possession of the Sword of Night, and how Brom came into possession of his own weapon, the magical Mace of Mists. But Brom was treacherous and ambitious, and he formed a pact with the magician Farben to betray and murder the king. But Nacht, who remains loyal to the king, gets in their way, and he greets Brom and his hench people in the castle to hold them off at the king's bedroom door, and they act out what is almost panel for panel, line of dialogue for line of dialogue, an exact replica of the fight that Jim Rook just had a couple of pages ago with those three generic heavies that broke into his dressing room. So a nifty little bit of parallelism inserted there by Denny O'Neil, just the everyday trials and travails of the average American 1960s countercultural outsider elevated to mythic chivalry. But then he has to go and spoil it all by have Jim say, "Hey, incredible, this cat Nacht was a lot like me. That brawl in the palace, it's a twin of the fight I had a few hours ago." Yes, Denny, bless you, we get it. We understand you were doing fine, the parallelism was clear, you didn't have to tell not show here. Anyway, so Zolto goes on to tell Jim that the reason the inhabitants of Myrrha now look like little blue munchkins is because they've been suffering an onslaught from Brom and his new allies, a cult of warlocks who've been flinging dark evil magic at them for decades, and it's destroyed their once proud castle and kingdom and shriveled them down into their dwarven state. So now, Jim Rook is here. He is a direct descendant of the warrior Nacht, who had been banished away to the Earth dimension by Farben and Brom. Apparently he started a family and a bloodline there on Earth that culminated in Jim Rook, and Zolto brought him over here so that he could claim his father's weapon, which has been embedded in a stone pillar all this time, just waiting for a descendant of Nacht to come and claim it, which Jim does. He pulls it right out. And he immediately finds himself having to use it to fend off an assault by a patrol of warlock warriors. Fortunately, the sword does all the fighting for him. All he has to do is follow its lead and do what... just follow the magical impulses it sends through his body, and he's able to dodge, turn, parry, dodge, ha-ha, spin, ha, thrust his way out of danger. And as he's doing so, he says to aloud, for the reader's benefit, "I feel like a character from Howard or Tolkien." So that's That's the association we're supposed to be making here. It'd be a little difficult, I've got to tell you, if Jim Rook didn't come out and tell us, per O'Neill's dialogue, that's what he feels like and what we're supposed to be. The parallel we're supposed to be drawing. Well, anyway, he finishes off at these warlocks and puts them to the rout, although King Zolto has to step in and finish off the last one for him. Then Zolto tells him, you have to go and defeat Brahm and his warlocks at their fortress on the other side of our land. Oh, by the way, your girlfriend Janet, I'm afraid she was snared by the warlocks in transit from your world, and they're holding her captive there, so there's an added incentive for you to go and do this thing I'm telling you to do. And then Zolto presents him with Nokt's old uniform, which is what he's wearing on the front cover, as I described to you earlier, blue bodysuit, N belt buckle, etc. Zolto even provides Jim with a traveling companion, his own version of Samwise Gamgee, who's he's basically the village idiot. His name is Boz. He's unusually tall. He's at least twice the size of the other Mirrans we've met so far. He's lanky. He's completely white, chalk white in skin and hair, and he speaks with kind of a rural bumpkin accent. He's like an albino Slim Pickens, really. He's like the sidekick in old Western movies. And so, having acquired all of his gear, his sword, his raiment, and his traveling companion, Jim Rook and Boz hop onto a giant grasshopper. Yes, those are words I just said, and they go striding off across the land. Not to the Warlock Fortress, though, since this is... O'Neill has to fill 3 issues with this stuff. First, they have to go off on a little side quest to the castle of the Ice Witch, because only the Ice Witch knows the magic password which will open the gates of the hidden fortress of the Warlock clan. So... off they go on their giant green grasshopper, and they come to the Ice Witch's palace, which is at the top of a gigantic icy peak, and there are no steps, no path to follow, so Nightmaster has to use his magic sword to hack hand and footholds for him and Boz to use as they climb to the top. Fighting off warlock attackers all the way, pretty much. When they finally reach the Ice Witch's palace, the Ice Witch is there wearing the borrowed form of Janet Jones. How she knew to do that, I'm not sure, but she deceives Jim immediately into thinking that she is his beloved and that his quest is over. Meanwhile, she's hiding a dagger behind her back. But Boz, simpleton that he appears to be, he recognizes her cat's eyes, because in this world, that's a sure sign of bad magic and pacts with dark powers. All those who have made such pacts have slit-pupiled cat's eyes, and the Ice Witch was not able to hide that in her glamour. However, Jim wants to believe that it's Janet, so he ignores Boz's advice and in fact turns around and smacks him full in the face, but in so doing, he accidentally touches the witch disguised as Janet with his magic sword, and no duplicitous magic can stand the touch of the Sword of Night. So instantly the witch is reverted to her normal blue-skinned dwarven form, and, from there, all Jim has to do is touch her again with the sword, and the magic sword puts her in a trance and forces her to speak the truth, and she reveals that the password to get into the Warlock Fortress is, Houghardboros Fox. So, Howard Burroughs Foxy, as in Robert E. Howard, Edgar Rice Burroughs, and Foxy, I guess. So Howard and Burroughs are, of course, contributors to the sword and sorcery genre, in the form of Conan and, I guess, John Carter, Warlord of Mars. So, yeah, a little nod and a wink to people who are in the know about this whole sword and sorcery thing. And then the witch, terrified that she has now involuntarily betrayed the warlocks, she teleports herself away, leaving Boz and Jim Rook to pace out the rest of their long, harrowing journey to the fortress of the Warlocks and Jim Rook's imperiled ladylove. So, there we go. And then that brings us to the end of the story, as we are urged by the closing caption to stay with Nightmaster as he presses his searing search for Janet, empowered by his mighty strange sword. Join him into his excursion into, and I am, that's verbatim, by the way. Join him into his excursion into the perilous, weird world which lies beyond reality in Sing a Song of Sorcery in the next issue of Showcase, number 83. So there you go. That is the first ever adventure of Jim Rook, the Nightmaster. And yes, it's perhaps not the ideal example of sword and sorcery fiction, and it's also, I'm pretty certain, not quite the story that Denny O'Neil really wanted to tell as he started out. Well, just to give you a glimpse into the thinking and suffering that that Denny O'Neil went through in the production of this strip, there is actually, as I review these things, these older comics, for you, my audience, the authorial text page is a very close friend of mine because it's a good window into the thinking of the writer, and there happens to be one of those here in showcase number 82. O'Neil has entitled it "Take That, You Hideous Magician, You," or "How I Stopped Worrying and Learned to Love Swordplay." And this is a page-long essay in which O'Neil, he spends the first half of it extolling and describing, in words carefully chosen to appeal to uninitiated, particularly superhero comics readers. And the second half of it gets into more specifics about the Nightmaster feature itself. And let me quote directly here. It's worth doing. "Call this a labor of love and curiosity. As I've mentioned, everyone involved in the creation of these pages wanted to do a sword and sorcery feature. We talked, we argued, occasionally we compromised. We sought inspiration in the efforts of Burroughs, Howard, Leiber, et al. We sought other places, too. The science fiction of Samuel R. Delany and Roger Zelazny, the music of the Beatles and the Doors, the paintings of sundry old masters. When we needed a dose of evil, we looked in our morning newspapers. Still a reliable source of evil to this very day, more's the pity. Finally, after many months, we produced the product you now hold. That was the love part. And the curiosity? We wondered why nobody was publishing a sword and sorcery comic magazine. It seems to us that the comics medium is perfectly suited to sword and sorcery's blend of action, grotesque beings, eerie places. Yet the few attempts in the past to embody S&S in panel art have been dismal failures. Readers left them languishing like ugly kittens. Perhaps these earlier attempts were badly done, and perhaps they weren't. More probably, potential fans simply hadn't discovered the special joys the pages offered. Such may be the fate of Nightmaster. Jim Rook may vanish into the limbo reserved for 3D movies, Edsel autos, and other ideas that tried to grab a piece of popularity and missed. But oh me, oh my, we don't like to think so, because this wasn't a job, this was fun. We've become fond of Jim and Janet. The prospect of abandoning them fills us with woe. We believe this showcase Nightmaster is pretty good. Not perfect, but pretty good. And we're convinced that, given time to correct our mistakes and develop the notions only hinted at in Jim's debut, we can make Nightmaster better. So, there you go. Here we have Denny O'Neil coming out and saying that sword and sorcery has been kind of a difficult thing to do in comics thus far, and he says this is a labor of love and curiosity. Love of the sword and sorcery genre, and curiosity as to why said genre had failed in comics before, and curiosity if it could be made to work successfully in 1969. And just the way he words things here makes it kind of clear that the concept has had its growing pains, and that it didn't turn out quite the way that O'Neil might have preferred. You notice that he mentions that he and his collaborators, including, I assume, editor Murray Boltinoff, had their arguments and compromises about all this. And and this is me reading between the lines here, but I don't think Denny really wanted to include all this business about the main character being a rock musician, of all things, from the East Village in the real world, 1969. Instead of the whole thing just being set, in-world, instead of it being like a self-contained realm of magic and adventure and what have you, we had to have a rock musician, the kind of character that an out-of-touch comics editor of the late 60s would probably think would be relatable to the youth. Have that person be, pull a Dorothy Gale and be spirited away, to coin the Miyazakian phrase, from the real world to this realm of sword and sorcery, and to have him, spout, jive lingo every step of the way and kind of, sarcastically undermine every little mythical hurdle that he has to face. When Zolto declares unto him that he is now, since he's the master of the sword of night, he will be known thenceforth as the Nightmaster. His only response is, "Hooray for me." Yeah, and which does kind of make me wonder, too, why Nightmaster as a name for this character in this strip? There's nothing necessarily or explicitly or overtly nocturnal about the character or his milieu. It's, unless you consider the fact that he's a musician, and musicians often perform at night. It's a great name, but it's not the best fit for the feature, and hence it's kind of a waste of a name that could have been used better elsewhere. And I digress. So anyway, I do respect what O'Neill and company were trying to do with this feature. I mean, they're trying to bring it's a labor of love again, as O'Neill himself said, trying to bring sword and sorcery back to comics again. But I'm afraid it became a little bit too compromised along the way. Too many cooks stirring the broth, perhaps. It's the injection of this 20th century pop appeal, because sort of undermines the project before it begins. And I get the feeling that O'Neill probably had to do something of this nature, something to make sword and sorcery seem a little bit more relatable to the kids, to get this feature approved in the first place. Hence, Jim Rook, rock musician. So, yeah, he's going for something that would do honor to its forebears in the persons of Conan the Barbarian, Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, Elric, John Carter, etc. Instead of something that is reminiscent of Howard or Tolkien, the high concept I would give it is H.R. Pufnstuf meets Sam Raimi's Army of Darkness, starring Jim Morrison. Because, let's face it, the character O'Neill didn't just pick the name Jim for his protagonist out of a hat. Yeah, it's almost certainly a sort of homage. It's trippy, it's strange, It's got a lot more in common with Lewis Carroll or L. Frank Baum or Sid and Marty Krofft than it has to do with Howard or Tolkien, I'm afraid. But it's still rollicking adventure, and there is potential in it. It's just, unfortunately, here's the tragic irony: Nightmaster probably would have worked better. It might even have found a solid foothold of success if it had only happened maybe 5 or 6 years later, when sword and sorcery imagery and rock and roll music and the subculture in general of the youth became merged a little more completely, and sword and sorcery stuff became something that the kids, as it were more aware of and into. And because you saw more and more sword and sorcery stuff happening in comics as the 70s wore on. Well, hell, Marvel had a great deal of success with a little something called Conan just a couple of years after Nightmaster saw print. I think Marvel started publishing Conan comics thanks to Roy Thomas's championing the property's cause in 1971. So if they could have just waited a few more years, and hate to say it since I love Denny O'Neill and I respect his body of work, but if they could have gotten somebody a little bit younger and a little bit more tuned in to what the kids were actually into, because, God love him, O'Neill is a fine writer, and I'm certain he was a worthy devotee of sword and sorcery, but in 1969 he was on the verge of turning 30. The age beyond which no one is to be trusted, as goes the old hippie adage. So, yeah, if they had gotten somebody, a younger music fan, and, it's even possible that they might have been able to form some kind of licensing agreement with an actual, real-world rock musician. Because, this... You can sort of add Nightmaster to a list of failed DC attempts to appeal to the 60s youth by incorporating rock music or musicians. It happened a few times over. And even when the editor and or creators aren't clueless oldsters, sorry, Denny, but that's about the situation, the adventures of fictitious musicians is a hard sell without any actual real music to cross-promote. So... yeah, that kind of was working against them, too. But a few years later, just look at what Marvel was able to do in the 70s through arrangements with Kiss and Alice Cooper and what have you. I mean, a few years into the 70s, we could have seen, instead of Jim Rook as Nightmaster, it might have been Jimmy Page. Or Rick Wakeman of Yes. Yeah, I think he would have been into that. So, yeah, it was just an idea that came a little bit before its time and was not in exactly the right hands to make the most of it that could have been. It wasn't such a terrible idea. It's just the execution makes it a little more trippy silly than it was really engaging and enjoyable and adventurous. Yeah. all I can think of is like Puff and Stuff the movie. Even like the Oblivion Inc. storefront, which, by the by, people who know of Jim Rook from his involvement in Shadow Pact, you may remember that he ran an interdimensional bar and for like a tavern for magical adventurer types called the Oblivion Bar. Well, here's where that name came from. In fact, that storefront, which kind of shifts between dimensional spaces, that is the very same place in which he eventually set up shop as a barkeep. But yeah, that moment where Jim and Janet trespass into the Oblivion Inc. and suddenly find themselves shifted across dimensional boundaries, that reminded me of well, the point at the beginning of a couple of different Sid and Marty Krofft shows when the main characters find themselves shunted from the real world to the realm of adventure. Like when little young Jimmy gets into that magic boat and goes up to Living Island, or when Mark falls into the magician's top hat in the beginning of Lidsville, or when Marshall, Will, and Holly fall over the waterfall into the land of the lost. That moment in the Oblivion Inc. storefront is it's that point of disassociation for me. You could also say it's like Dorothy going through the cyclone, or Alice going through the looking glass or down the rabbit hole. I'm sure that it's, in Campbellian terms, there's a word for this, and the concept certainly predates the 70s kiddie shows that I'm referencing here. But since this comic was produced at the same time as those kiddie shows, H.R. Puff and Stuff also came on television in 1969. I should add that I can't help but think in those terms when I'm reading it. And you know what? That's fine with me. I enjoy trippiness. I mean, even if this comic, in my opinion, was a bit wide of the bullseye as far as doing what it wanted to do and bringing a successful sword and sorcery strip to the late 60s comic scene, it's still pretty enjoyable as an artifact of 60s kitsch after the fact. And the fact that O'Neill couldn't help but he was trying to keep the kids involved, I guess, by making it kind of silly and self-subversive and self-parodying, but it kind of resulted in the whole thing devolving into camp, But still, that made it all the more enjoyable for me as a latter-day reader of it. And I also have to give a tip of the hat to artist Jerry Grandanetti, because, God love him, he was kind of he somehow became a go-to guy for these geezer-driven youth-exploitation attempts of DC in the late 60s, early 70s, because he's also the man who put together the pencils for Joe Simon's Prez. There's a little cross-promotion plug here. Don't miss the Comic Geek Speak episode of Comics and Politics Prez, which was re-released by our producer Ian just a little bit ago. It was recorded several years ago as part of a crossover between various comics podcasts, each of which was told to just take the theme comics and politics in whatever direction you want. And we, of course, went straight to Prez, which was penciled by Jerry Grandanetti. And I gotta say, his trippy visuals here in Showcase number 82 are actually kind of perfect for the kind of story that Nightmaster turned out to be. If not, they would probably not have been perfect for the kind of story that O'Neill would have preferred this to be, though. To unlock the concept's full potential, you'd have needed like a Frank Frazetta, somebody who had a background in comics and also sword and sorcery and also rock and roll album cover art. I'd also throw out the name Roger Dean, or, a guy named Barry Windsor Smith, who you may have heard of, who's done a couple of things with sword and sorcery in comics, too. So with their artwork, this might have really taken off. Now, actually, Jerry Grandanetti only did the first issue of this 3-issue run of Nightmaster in Showcase. The issues number 83 and 84 were penciled by the person who was supposed to have done all of it, but couldn't quite get it together in time to do the first issue. And that man is Bernie Wrightson. So he stepped in and drew issues 83 and 84 with an artistic assist from his friends and studio mates, Jeff Jones and Michael William Kaluta. Now, I do not own and have not read issues 83 and 84. I can't tell you how they differ in visual style from what I've seen here in 82. Maybe it comes off a little less silly, trippy. I gotta tell you, though, if it does, I'd almost be disappointed, because I really did enjoy issue number 82 here. Issues 83 and 84 may have a slightly different flavor with Wrightson artwork. I can't be the one to tell you. So, there you are. Those are the origins of that monster of magic and rock known as Jim Rook the Nightmaster. A couple of other fun little things about this issue, though, since it was published in 1969, which happens to be the 30th anniversary of a certain Caped Crusader. That's right. Right after that text page of my O'Neill about Nightmaster and Sword and Sorcery that I quoted to you, there is a nice long text page entitled Detective Comics number 27, Fact File number 7. Yeah, because this issue of Showcase is cover dated May of 69, and Detective number 27 came out in May of 39. So it's just like a full page of filler prose about Batman's first appearance, which was just then making its 30th anniversary. And on the facing page to that is a full-page house ad, further indicating just DC in the late 60s was in kind of a period during which they were trying way too hard and not at all too well to relate to young readers and accommodate their tastes, and it's just, the results were often comical, to say the least. A lot of you are going to know the kind of things I'm talking about. Prez is actually an example. But just looking at the hysterical style of their house ads, like this full-page thing here advertising the 30th anniversary issue of Batman in Detective Comics number 387. And their way of saying that is, up in the upper left, there's a big blurb saying, "We're having a happening!" Sure you are, DC. Yeah, so that's just one of several examples of these wonderful, these super fab pop art powered house ads that they run. My favorite, I'm going to try and find it here earlier in the issue. It's on. It's between story pages 4 and 5. There's a couple of ad pages like this in the issue where it's kind of a 4-square structure, where there's on the top there's the cover of an upcoming DC comic on one half of the upper half of the page, and then the other half is a panel about the same size with just this big screaming graphic relating to the cover. Like the upper half of this page I'm looking at is an issue of Lieutenant Hunter's Hellcats, and on the other side of there's the cover of that month's issue on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, it's Bedlam in Berlin! There's only one escape route open for Lieutenant Hunter and his Hellcats, the tunnel, and the Nazis flooded it! And that's actually somewhat restrained, and it's kind of your typical comic book promotional hype. Nothing too outlandish about that. But then look at the bottom half of the page, because I know you've all got your own copies of Showcase number 82 open in front of you. I'm sorry. This is one case where I kind of miss doing this over Zoom, so we can post visuals to YouTube. You're just going to have to use your imaginations here, folks. But the lower half is the cover of Aquaman number 45, cover dated June of 69. The image is Aquaman sprawled, his lifeless body sprawled on a beach, the waves lapping against his legs. He's got a giant note pinned to his chest, wanted by the underworld, dead or alive. The alive part is crossed out. His costume is torn. He's showing no signs of movement or breathing. In the background, on a sandy dune behind him, a young woman is grieving with her head on her knees, with her head in her hand, as the sun rises behind her. It's a pretty dramatic cover, but it's for drama, it's got nothing on the little panel provided as a promotional accompaniment to it. Just next to it, it's this giant mass of green concentric circles, almost looking like a bottle of Tide, or like the opening to a Looney Tunes cartoon. Just these green circles, one inside the other, and in the center, in gigantic letters, the single word, "Why?" ? And below it, on sale March 4th. It's wannabe Warholism, and it's just hilarious in how poorly it works. So, yeah, that's late 60s DC for you. It's usually a good time. So, yep, there you are. Showcase number 82 and the arrival of the Nightmaster. Let's hit the return button on the Time Bubble's control console and shunt ourselves back to the default present for our Time Bubble voyages, our dry dock, if you will, i.e. early 2002, which is, just to stop and consider this for a moment, 20 years ago now. Think of that. Henceforth, about the most recent you can expect any comic you hear about on this podcast to be is 20 years ago. Yep, it's having a hard time getting that one to sink in. Anyway, so back to 2002. I've kind of planned this episode to follow a 2x2 format, where we talk about two subject comics that were old, as of when I bought them in January 2002, and two that were contemporary to that time. So we're going to move on and talk about one of those two contemporary things. It's a DC comic, and it's actually not a single comic book, but an entire month-long event. And it all begins with JLA, and yes, that is the volume of JLA that began with Grant Morrison and Howard Porter back in the fall of '96, that JLA, number 61, cover dated March of '02, which means that it actually, it's cover dated February of '02, which means that it actually came out in December of 2001, and it is part of, well, event is maybe too strong a word, and stunt or gimmick is too paltry and dismissive, and initiative is maybe a little too high-flown as well. Let's call it's part of the cover motif for the month of December 2001 that DC in-house referred to as full coverage. I think I mentioned it in my last episode, or the one before that. The idea was all DC comics, or at least all ongoing DC comics published in that month, featured different cover design. It's covers in which the standard trade dress and cover indicia were marginalized, made very small, and moved to like the upper corners or the margins of the cover, and the center image was left as unobstructed as possible for the potential purchaser's enjoyment. Even the title, like the title cover logo of the comic, was incorporated Will Eisner style into the composition of the main image of the cover. So here we are with JLA number 61. We have the letters JLA spelled out in very large letters in chain lightning along the bottom of the cover, with the membership of the JLA as of this issue either soaring, leaping, or, in Plastic Man's case, stretching heroically directly up into the sky above and around those chain lightning letters. So this issue is actually significant and time bubble worthy for a couple of different reasons. The first of which being that it's the debut of a new creative team for this volume of JLA. I mean, this is safely after Grant Morrison had moved on to other things, and also after Mark Waid had his say. This is the beginning of the run for writer Joe Kelly and penciler Doug Mahnke. And inker Tom Nguyen along for the ride as well. This is the start of their run on the JLA, and I've described the cover already. The story within is entitled 2-Minute Warning, and it jumps around in time, which is it's kind of a favorite storytelling technique of many writers of the time, and even unto this day. But Joe Kelly enjoyed playing around with it as well. It jumps back and forth, somewhat jarringly, actually, between action in the present, like the JLA is called upon to defeat a world-level threat of a couple of giant mythological monsters wreaking havoc out in the middle of the ocean, who are under the control of a classic Flash rogue, who in turn is under the control of a malign little hideous brain leech that has crawled up into his brain pan somehow. Plastic Man actually has to use his stretching powers to reach up into the Flash villain's nose and pluck the little bugger out. Yes, that's memorable. And so it jumps back and forth between the leagues battling with this triple threat, as it were, and 2 minutes earlier, a point in time, just 2 minutes earlier, where we see what the different JLA members were doing as their JLA signal devices started to beep and alert them to this threat that they all needed to go and neutralize. So it's a glimpse into their daily doings. It's some good character moments as a result of that. It's kind of a day in the life story, if you will. It's nice and self-contained and fast-paced, and it gives you some good insight into the league, and also gives you an idea of the kind of widescreen ideas and action set pieces that Joe Kelly has in mind for this book. He has big shoes to fill, of course, following in the footsteps of Grant Morrison and Mark Waid, and he comes racing right out of the starting gate with this story. It's already been reprinted in at least one Best of the JLA collection that I know of. The roster he has to work with here is basically the classic 7 of the JLA, the 7 founding members, plus Plastic Man, and minus Aquaman, as it happens, because Aquaman, as of the beginning of 2002, is missing and presumed dead in the wake of the Our Worlds at War event. However, his presence is still felt. There's a couple of foreshadowing moments in here, which is kind of giving the idea that Aquaman's time with this group and in the DC universe has not come to an end, as if any long-term comic book reader believed for an instant that it had been. But yeah, it's kind of hinting at something that Joe Kelly had in mind for the future, which would turn out to be the Obsidian Age arc, in which Kelly and Monkey's JLA gained a few new members, and also in which that expanded JLA roster went on a rescue mission back in time to the prehistory of the DC universe to try and locate and rescue Aquaman and return him home. But that's all on the horizon at this point. All Joe Kelly is thinking of doing right now is introducing everyone to his takes on the core JLA members, and to kind of whet our appetite for the kind of high-intensity, high-adrenaline, high-intellect action he has in mind for this series. And Kelly he's one of the better writers of his generation, I think. You don't hear from him as much anymore these days, but his most recent work for the Big Two was something called Non-Stop Spider-Man, in which he's continuing to do the high-adrenaline action thing, but throwing in a bit of his personal brilliance as well. The pacing is very swift in this story, and a little on the choppy side. I mean, as I said before, he cuts back and forth between the present and a few minutes ago, just to show us how swiftly and how decisively the JLA have to put themselves into action and respond to massive superhuman threats in their line of work. Just what kind of pressure it is to be a member of this elite group of superheroes. You do sometimes have to read a scene twice. I've mentioned in earlier outings on the Time Bubble that Kelly has a tendency not to spoon-feed exposition and transitions to you. He does make you... He expects a little more out of the reader, and it can be a little frustrating at times, but it's ultimately rewarding. And Doug Monkey, this is his debut after his debut on the Justice League. He had a pretty solid run on Superman Man of Steel before this, and he drew all 15 issues of the Major Bummer title, written by John Arcudi, which is a little-known 90s DC gem about a slacker who gains superpowers and doesn't want to do anything with them. And he'd done other projects besides. I think he became known to fandom as an artist on Dark Horse's The Mask comics. And here he's really putting his abilities to... on display on a wider screen and a larger canvas than ever before. And he's an artist who really knows how to find beauty in the grotesque, as witnessed the hideous brain parasite that Plastic Man drags out of the villain's schnozola, and also to find grotesquerie in the beautiful. Yeah, just looking at the way he draws the muscular physiques of the different members of the JLA. Yeah, they're not exactly Vitruvian. You know, he kind of delights in distortion at times, which is why it's so great that he got the chance to draw a team like the JLA, which has two, alpha-class shapeshifters on it in Plastic Man and John Jones, the Martian Manhunter. And so those two characters really give him a chance to flex his creative muscles. Plus, of course, there's all the other characters, Green Lantern and the giant energy constructs he creates, the huge monsters of Greek... There's a Kraken and a huge Cyclops monster battling each other. And so Monkey's really strutting his stuff in his debut here as the JLA artist of record. So, yep, it's off to a good start here, this run of this creative team, but that's only one reason of two why I decided I needed to highlight this issue for you guys. The JLA lead story also contains a primo Steve Miller Band reference. I challenge you to read the story and find it for yourself. That's not the other reason, though. It's just reason 1.2 of why I thought I would mention this comic in this podcast. The other reason is that it's an introduction of a new concept in team superheroics, brought to the DC universe by one of my favorite writers in the comics medium of all time, Mr. Kurt Busiek. And this is what causes JLA number 61 to be the lead-in into that month-long event that I mentioned that ran through DC. It didn't run through DC Comics. It was a part of DC's publishing lineup throughout the month of January 2002. And I'm talking here about Kurt Busiek's creation, The Power Company. Yes, which he co-created with artist Tom Grummett and inker Wade von Grawbadger, known to many of you for his Starman work. And it is this creative team that produces a preview tale, like 14-page preview, at the back of Jla Number 61. It says right on the front cover, bonus inside, an exclusive preview of the Power Company. And this is bound to make all the Crisis kids out there in my audience nostalgic for the heyday of the 1980s when DC would preview upcoming new books with the special pull-out preview sections jammed in the middle of issues of their ongoing series. This is how the world was introduced to things like the New Teen Titans and the All-Star Squadron and Amethyst, Princess of Power, or Princess of Gemworld, excuse me. Yeah, slip of the tongue there. So, yes, this is not an insert. It is, in fact, just a backup story. It's at the back of the issue, right after the JLA lead story, which is your standard 22-page story with ads interspersed. Then you get, after the letters page at the end of that, you jump right into the Power Company. 14 extra pages of content for no additional cost, just to carry the $2.25 cover price that was standard for an issue of JLA back in the early 2000s. So the story is called The Power Principle, and in it we bear witness to a bunch of oil company executives having a meeting on their secluded island HQ, being set upon and captured by a terrorist organization calling themselves the Black Dragon Society, who claim to resent Western corporate interference on the Asian continent. And they capture these executives and threaten to murder them all as soon as their point has been made to global media. But one of the executives among them reaches into his pocket and pulls out a signal device, and that brings in the best superheroic cavalry that money can buy, the Power Company. And we get several pages of them making short works of these generic and possibly slightly crypto-racist terrorists. And it ends with the senior partner of the group, Josiah Power, arriving on the scene in his full suit and power tie, and bringing with him a medical team and also the oil exec's insurance agent, just to smooth everything over in the wake of this foiled terrorist attack, as the Black Dragons are being led away to waiting military submarines in chains. And then on page 9, what a twist! The camera pulls back and we discover that the entire first 8 pages of the story were not actually the Power Company in action. It was all part of a promotional film that the company had put together to distribute to potential clients. It was all completely staged. There is no such thing as the Black Dragon Society, even in the DC universe. It's all a sham, and it's designed to play on the fears and paranoia of wealthy and powerful CEOs and whatnot, who fear they may run afoul of actual real, quote-unquote, within the DC universe, superpowered threats or terrorist incursions or what have you. And so we get a couple of pages then of the Power Company members, or partners, because the whole shtick with the Power Company is that it is a superhero team, but run and managed and structured along the lines of a business firm, and specifically a law firm. So there are senior partners and junior partners and agents, and there's billing and pro bono work and the whole 9 yards. This was an idea that Busiek came up with several years earlier, 20 or more years, actually, in the early 80s. And many of the characters involved here underwent quite a lengthy evolution from when he first thought of them back in the 80s, and had to be evolved still further to make them fit into the then present-day DC universe. So we get these characters' reactions, and one of them, the veteran old-school hero among them, a lady named Skyrocket, is not happy about it at all, and she has a heart-to-heart with Josiah Power, the leader and founder and senior partner of the group, telling them that she has misgivings about the fakery, the shams, and playing on the fears of the wealthy and powerful. She says, quote, "I don't like how mercenary it all feels." And I may conclude that maybe the superhero readership didn't care for that aspect of this whole concept either, because, it's, as we'll see, it didn't last very long. The Power Company didn't, that is. And after this heart-to-heart, Skyrocket takes off, and for the remaining 4 pages of this preview story that's supposed to introduce us to the Power Company, we instead shift focus completely away from the Power Company and to one of a character that's supposed to be one of their lead antagonists in the first arc or two of the Power Company ongoing series, and that is Dr. Cyber, who is a Wonder Woman opponent who dates back to Princess Diana's mod years in the late 60s. Here, Tom Grummett has redesigned her. She's armored from head to toe, plus a flowing hooded purple cloak to complete the ensemble. She looks a little bit too much like Marvel's Madame Mask, for my money. But anyway, these final 4 pages are just focusing on her as she and a retinue of armed guards and technicians in her employ, all female, because that's Dr. Cyber's N.O. She's a radical militant techno-feminist. They go to a secluded island to meet with a potential ally, which turns out to be a supernatural being that hides itself behind a large draping. It invites Dr. Cyber close and bids her place her hand on its crystalline surface. The plot thickens. And suddenly she screams in agony, and she's disintegrated. Just right before her horrified employees and support staff. And the thing declares to them, "I have simply done as I promised her. I have solved all her problems, present and future. So let us move on and discuss what we shall do about the Power Company." ... And thus the story ends, leaving the readers also to wonder to themselves what they will do about the Power Company. Will they pick that series up when it debuts or not? And all this action, incidentally, is it's a big flash forward to a point several weeks DC Universe time into the existence of the Power Company, taking place between issues, I don't know, like 5 and 6 or something like that of the Power Company ongoing series, which was set to debut maybe a month or so from the publication date of this issue of JLA. So there's the world's first glimpse of Kurt Busiek's Power Company. And I have to say, I'm sure that at the time I trusted Busiek, implicitly, and I also was a big fan of Grummett's artwork, just as clean and dynamic as it always has been. And so I was already, in like flint for this whole Power Company shebang. But if I hadn't been, I'm not sure whether this little 14-page preview story would really have sold me on it. Because you really don't get to see that much of them. You see the team in action, albeit under contrived circumstances, as we learn in the twist on page 9. But it's a good display, or it's a good showcase for their powers and for their visuals and all that, but you don't get to see very much of their personalities. It's more action than character. The bit with Dr. Cyber at the end is fairly intriguing, especially if you're a fan of old school, like Bronze Age DC villains. You're wondering what could possibly have laid Dr. Cyber low. We just got her back. She'd been in limbo for such a long time, and she's already dead. So that's a bit of a fun cliffhanger, but it doesn't really package these characters in the Power Company, most of which are new characters that the average DC Comics fan would never have seen before. As a matter of fact, some of them were completely new. I mean, there's only like 2 of them that even have any kind of provenance in the DCU whatsoever, and even they are on the obscure side. So really, Busiek doesn't do a whole lot to introduce them and make them appealing to the reader. Now, there is a reason for that. Because Busiek planned to go into such detail characterizing these new characters and just fleshing them out and selling them to the readers that he wanted to do so at full issue length. So, turning to the final page of JLA number 61, after the Power Company preview, is a hype page emblazoned with the following words: announcing the newest concept in superhuman services, the Power Company Power Surge, exploding into stores every week this January in 7 specials, all written by Kurt Busiek. So that's right. The event to which I alluded earlier, which this JLA issue kicks off, is the Power Surge event. And Power Surge, incidentally, it's just kind of an in-house umbrella term for the 7 one-shot specials that spun out of this JLA issue, and that spun into the Power Company ongoing series, which would premiere shortly thereafter. The word Power Surge doesn't actually appear in any of the cover bannering of those 7 one-shots, since that I guess they felt that would have muddied the branding. People would wonder whether Power Surge was the title of this new team, or if the Power Company was. So it was probably smart for them not to, do anything more with the name Power Surge than to put it on this page and then leave it alone. So yes, 7 one-shots, each of which is dedicated to one cast member of the upcoming Power Company series. Each one is written by Kurt Busiek. Each one's got a different all-star art team. Each one is set a different period of time in the past, just to retroactively set up these characters at their appropriate spots in recent DC history, just to show everyone that they may be completely new, but that doesn't mean that they haven't been around the DC universe having adventures of their own, just to assure everyone that they're seasoned adventurers. And each one also has a different established DC universe character as a guest star. Some of them even have more than one guest star, which is, again, smart marketing if you're trying to get DC Comics fans somewhat invested in committing a certain amount of money to reading character development for these brand new characters of whom no one had ever heard before. So, anyway, 7 one-shots, and I happen to have all of them here in my lap, and yes, I am planning to speed run through all of them right here and right now. So just strap yourself in, here we go, introducing you to the Power Company characters one by one, in roughly their order of publication, because there is a breakdown of that week by week at the back of Jla Number 61. The first one-shot was featuring the senior partner, the founder and CEO, Josiah Power. In a one-shot written by Busiek, with art by Keith Giffen and inker Al Milgrom. And this is set, quote-unquote, 5 years ago. And you gotta remember, this is a flexible, elastic, rolling DC universe time we're talking about here. So, 5 years ago appears to land us right in the wake of the Invasion event. Which was a major DC Universe crossover, which was published along about 1988. And we learned that Josiah Power, he was a pretty formidable figure even before he acquired his superhuman powers. He was well over 6 feet tall, big, bulky, muscular, bald, with an epic chin beard. And he was a high-powered attorney on the West Coast. But then, the Invasion event happened, and which consisted of an alliance of alien races attempting to invade, and overrun, and conquer the planet Earth, because that always works out so well for aliens in comic books. But Earth's heroes, with some outside help from more benign alien races, run them off, but not before, as kind of a last-ditch fail-safe contingency, the Alien Alliance detonates what they call a metagene bomb in Earth's atmosphere, which triggers the metagenes of quite a few human beings throughout the planet Earth. And this was a fun little plot device that was kind of thrown in there by DC at the time as a convenient catch-all explanation for a variety of new super-powered heroes, criminals, etc., without having to go through the problem, go through the bother of contriving a whole slew of different laboratory accidents, recently unearthed magical artifacts, etc. It's a mass origin story, basically. It's a way that they can introduce a bunch of new superpowered characters without having to explain where the powers came from. And, some 15 or so years later, Kurt Busiek is still making use of that because he ties Josiah Power's origin into the detonation of the metagene bomb. And Josiah Power's powers involve transforming himself into a being of living stone with some kind of barely containable energy manipulation abilities into the bargain. He hulks out, as it were, in the middle of a court deposition, and it basically destroys his career. He's shown out of his firm, and he's left at kind of a crossroads. He has a scene of soul-searching here with his longtime companion, Roop. So, yes, Busiek kind of blows his own horn. Each one of these one-shots ends in a page of explanatory background notes from Busiek about the evolution of the character portrayed in a given one-shot. Also, there will be a design sketch from Tom Grummett showing the visual evolution of said character. And in one of those, he mentions how he somehow or other ended up with a more diverse cast, in terms of ethnicity, sexuality, etc., than most other on the stands in 2002. And this is well before diversity and representation became a hot-button issue. So Busiek was kind of ahead of the curve here. And right here, the leader of the group is this large, muscular, black, gay man who is also a high-powered San Francisco lawyer. So kudos to Busiek for having been so far ahead of the pack as far as that goes. So the issue explains how Josiah Power felt lost after having been outed as a superhuman freak in the wake of the metagene bomb detonation. He answers an ad somewhere offering a new lease on life and new opportunities for those whose metagene was triggered by the metagene bomb during the invasion. He answers it, goes to Metropolis to answer it, and finds he was expecting some kind of group therapy, perhaps, but instead he finds himself captured and enslaved by a mysterious being called the Agent, who plans to rent them out as supervillains, mercenaries for hire. And he's trapped in this situation for rather too long a time before finally the Bwahaha-era Justice League, and also, of course, Metropolis's favorite son, Superman, show up and let Josiah and his fellow captives free, and Josiah himself, of course, plays an important role in this mass breakout. And having found liberation, he finds himself again at loose ends, but he has a heart-to-heart talk with Superman, who encourages him, you're a smart man, Mr. Power. You're not a man who's stymied by obstacles, so give this some attention. You'll think of something, I'm sure. And sure enough, inspired both by Superman and by his unfortunate experience, being shanghaied into a super mercenary press gang, Josiah is inspired to found the power company eventually to provide some real opportunities for people who, like him, find themselves in possession of superpowers that they are not sure what to do with, and that may set them apart from the rest of humanity. And ironically, he ends up following something similar to the business model espoused by the Agent, the slaver that captured him and all the other unfortunate metagene active people. The only difference is his group of mercenaries for hire receive a cut of the proceeds and are equal partners. Yeah, this one shot it's art by Giffen and Milgram. It's just dripping with it's pure early '90s Superman comics. It's immersed in the world of Metropolis of the early '90s with all its Kirby influenced trappings. If you're a fan of the Superman comics of that period, you certainly should own and read a copy of this Josiah Power special. Number 2 on the hit parade, then, the second Power Company member we'll meet is Striker Z. This one is, again, written by Busiek, with art by Ramon F. Bax and Raul Fernandez, the inker. And it is set in Hong Kong 2 years ago, relative time. And the main character is one Danny Tsang, who is a stuntman in the Hong Kong film scene. And we were introduced to him and his friend, the stoic special effects technician Charlie Lau. Charlie used to be a technician at Star Labs' Hong Kong facility, and he uses his connections there to sneak Danny and a film crew into that Star Lab facility to film a stunt for an upcoming action movie. And in the course of that, Danny falls into a large vat of fuel plasma, whatever that precisely is, along with a live power wire, and the combination of electricity and scary chemical gunk, of course, results in superhuman powers. Danny is transformed into a living battery that can empower any device. He also gains superhuman strength into the deal. So his pal Charlie then cooks up a whole bunch of nifty little modular gadgets for him, including his trademark striker plates, which are basically it's part stun gun and part brass knuckles. He can punch any solid object, and there will be a discharge of power that basically shatters it apart. He also rigs up a flight harness for Danny so he can fly, and all kinds of other little doodads that Danny carries around on his utility belt, as it were. And his body, is the convenient power source for all of this stuff. And his first thought, of course, is how to cash in on these powers in the film industry. Maybe make it out of Hong Kong and over to North America, to Hollywood. But then he and Charlie, and also superhuman guest star Superboy, this is, of course, the clone Superboy, Con-El, during his fade cut and disco belts 90s period, before he became Connor Kent and joined the Teen Titans. He had connections in Hawaii, did Con-El, and so he happens to be nearby when bad stuff goes down in Hong Kong. A mysterious supervillain called the Golden Sorcerer appears on the scene. He's several stories tall, and he seems to be able to control all of reality with just a wave of his hand. And it turns out that this Golden Sorcerer is just the abusive director under whom Danny was working on the film, that they got his powers while shooting. So with that knowledge, apparently this director guy... this fuel plasma stuff that Danny fell in at the Star Labs facility, it's apparently liquid magic, because this director just kind of got a supply of it for himself and bathed in it, and it turned him into a wizard. But fortunately, he's a wizard with an extreme lack of imagination. He's just a no-talent hack of a filmmaker, and the best he can do is sprout to giant size and throw action and fantasy movie cliches, but basically direct quotations from his own films at Danny. And Danny, in his costumed identity as Stryker Z, teams up with Superboy to vanquish the Golden Sorcerer, drain his fuel plasma-created pseudo-magical powers and send him off to the Hooskow. And so Danny finds himself inspired by this little encounter with Superboy to finally make that trip over to North America, to Hollywood, and maybe to do something more with his superpowers than just star in movies while he's there. Although Superboy does mention him to, maybe try out for the JLA or the Teen Titans while you're over there. And Danny is left wondering as Superboy flies off, the Teen Titans, huh? I wonder if they have a health plan. So he's maybe more inclined to be a superhero now than he was before, but he's still thinking fiscally. So he's kind of a perfect candidate for membership or partnership, as it were, in the power company. Number 3, we're introduced to Witchfire, someone who's even more deeply entrenched in the entertainment world than our boy Danny in Hong Kong. She is an American character, née Rebecca Carstairs. We're told in this story that she was originally a poor, neglected little orphan girl at an orphanage in Massachusetts, until one day she's poking around in the attic of the orphanage and she finds an old spell book with magic spells inside of it. And she makes use of the magic she learns from this old forgotten tome to make herself into someone who will never be ignored again. So, yes, she grows up to become an entertainer, a singer, actress, model, daredevil, you name it. Yes, and we know this is her origin story because at one point in this issue she shouts it in the face of her agent backstage at a concert she's giving when said agent gets on her case about giving away too much of her wealth to charity. As a matter of fact, she's on a concert tour. She's come back to Massachusetts near her old orphanage, and she decides impulsively to give away all the proceeds from that night's concert to the said orphanage. This story is set 6 years ago, about during the time in Wonder Woman's post-crisis history when she was calling Boston her home base. And indeed, Wonder Woman is the guest star in this issue because she and Vanessa Capitelis, the teenage daughter of Wonder Woman's friend and mentor, Professor Julia Capitelis, are attending Witchfire's concert. Turns out Vanessa is a fan, and Diana is taking her to see Witchfire in concert. So Witchfire is... her main character trait and or flaw is that she's kind of addicted both to attention, to being in the spotlight, and also to just danger and thrills. Unlike many of the other magic users in comic books, she is 0% zen. She is an adrenaline junkie, and she just uses magic to fuel that, and also to garner fame and notoriety. We see her doing a motorcycle stunt over a western gorge near the beginning of this story, actually. The creative team is, of course, Busiek and artist Matt Haley, and wonderful inks by Carl Kiesel, one of my favorites. Witchfire and her backup band, the Familiars, are performing and rocking on, and she gets this wonderful idea midway through the performance to just start chanting some strange words she found on an old parchment in a curio shop in Opal City earlier. And, of course, this results in the invocation of a demonic entity, and that entity is none other than... in a rare pre-Blackest Night DC Universe cameo, ladies and gentlemen, put your skeletal hands together for Necron, Lord of the Unliving! That's right. Probably some of you may have thought that Jeff Johns created Necron for the Blackest Night crossover, but no. He actually stems back to the early 80s and the Tales of the Green Lantern Corps miniseries. And in fact, the magic words that Witchfire chants to bring Necron into the DCU dimension sound an awful lot like the creative team on that issue. Bahar Wayne Staten. And the creators in question are Mike W. Barr, Len Wein, and Joe Staten. So there you go, little homage to the creator of this issue's guest villain. So Necron pops out and does his impression of Eddie the giant zombie skeleton at an Iron Maiden concert, and Wonder Woman has to spring into action, and she and Witchfire working together get to drive him back into his death dimension whence he came. After which, of course, Wonder Woman gives Witchfire a real stern talking to about using magic frivolously. And Witchfire promises her that she'll be a good girl and will never do it again. She'll double her donation to the orphanage. She'll pay for the damage caused to the concert venue. But then the end of the issue shows that Witchfire's ways have certainly not been changed. She had her fingers crossed behind her back, and no lesson has been learned other than that of foreshadowing. So there's Witchfire, and she too finds her way into the Power Company cast somehow or other. She's, for my money, she's one of the more interesting characters introduced by Busiek for this project. Next up, though, is Skyrocket, the one whom I mentioned is kind of the holdout as far as her willingness to participate in all this mercenary activity and dishonest promotion of same. She is the most classically superheroic of the characters that make up the Power Company cast. In fact, we're told that she made her debut 7 years ago, which is when this one-shot is set. The creative team here is Busiek, artist the aforementioned Joe Staten, co-creator of Necron, and inker Christian Alamy. And Skyrocket is actually, her alter ego is Navy Lieutenant Celia Forrestal. She is an aviator, and she is disgruntled because she has been trying for years to find herself into some kind of combat duty where she can actually fly some planes, and instead her commanding officer keeps sticking her on instruction detail, teaching other naval cadets, pilots, how to fly instead of actually getting to do it herself in the field. So she takes a leave of absence, goes home to sort out her feelings, and home, as it turns out, is St. Louis, Missouri, because we are told that she, ultimately, once she gains her powers and identity, she becomes the premier resident hero of St. Louis, and was active there for many years, and Busiek assures us she was present at all the major company-wide crossovers off-panel. So she's been active as a hero for some time. This is set 7 years ago, and if 5 years ago takes the Josiah Power one-shot back to the Invasion crossover, 7 years ago probably takes us back to, I don't know, late Bronze Age, somewhere around 1979, perhaps. So anyway, she visits her parents back in St. Louis, who happen to be inventors, and they show her their latest invention, the Argo Harness, which enables its wearer to convert energy all the way across the electromagnetic spectrum for a dazzling variety of effects, including flight. So it's basically a flight pack. Whenever she uses it to fly, it creates this five-pointed, star-shaped energy manifestation on her back. It's kind of an interesting visual effect. But no sooner have Celia's parents given her this little demonstration and allowed her to put it on and put it through its paces for a couple of minutes, when suddenly the outer wall of their workshop is blown in by a bunch of armored terrorists from an organization called Scorpio, and they've come here to this lab to try and find this weapon that the Forrestals have supposedly been working on. But the tragic irony here is that there was no weapon. The Argo Harness was never intended for military purposes. The Forrestals have already turned down several lucrative offers from both the military and some private concerns for this new technology, the nature of which is not well known beyond the walls of their laboratory. It's assumed to have military applications. So basically, these Scorpio terrorists killed Celia's parents for nothing. For technology that did not really exist, or at least not in the form that they assumed it did. Meanwhile, Celia is pinned under some rubble and goes completely undetected by the terrorists, who don't do a very thorough job of searching the place, apparently. So they leave, she crawls out of the rubble, and she, of course, immediately swears revenge. She goes off with her Argo Harness in place, and She runs into another superhero and also a fellow test pilot, Hal Jordan, active as the Green Lantern in this period. And so those of you who are fans of Green Lantern comics of the 70s and 80s, you get to see Joe Staton draw him again, which is a definite bonus. And the two of them team up, and they, because Hal is in town chasing Scorpio, and the two of them team up to take them down and bring them into custody. And later, after Celia's parents' funerals, Hal shows up in mufti to converse with Celia, person to person. He put two and two together and figured out who this mysterious new armored hero was that helped him round up Scorpio. And he gives her some advice and a pep talk to use her powers in the name of justice. And she takes him to heart, and inspired by some random cloying remarks she remembers her grandfather making while watching fireworks together one 4th of July during her childhood, she names herself Skyrocket. She paints her costume in the colors of the flag, red, white, and blue, red and white stripes with a big white star right over her chest. And she becomes the hero of St. Louis, and at some point she too finds her way into the power company, somewhat reluctantly, to become one of its one of its partners. Not the senior partner, of course, but a partner. And she kind of becomes the group's conscience. Okay, we're halfway home, folks. And next we come to one of the two pre-existing DCU characters that Busiek tapped to be members of the Power Company. This one-shot is entitled Bork. No, the Swedish chef does not appear in these pages, although more is the pity. It's written by Busiek with art by Kieran Dwyer. And it features Karl Bork, a character who was last seen in his one and only previous appearance in The Brave and the Bold, number 81, 1968, a Bob Haney written story entitled But Bork Can Hurt You! And that was this was, of course, during the team-up period, the Batman team-up period of Brave and the Bold. And it was a Batman and Barry Allen Flash team-up story, as they went up against Bork, who was he was a longshoreman, a dock worker and merchant seaman with criminal aspirations. And his origin story went, he jumped ship from the merchant vessel on which he was crewing with a bunch of stolen gold, and he drove his boat right into a storm, and he rescued a young boy he found floundering in the water there, brought him to a nearby South Seas island, an inhabited island as it turns out. The boy's father happens to be the chief there. English language map makers in the DC universe know it as Desolation Island. I'm sure the inhabitants have a better name for it than that. But the chief is so pleased that Bork saved his son from drowning that he performs some ritual magic upon him to protect him and strengthen him for his future benevolent endeavors, which results in Bork becoming superhumanly strong and completely invulnerable. And Bork immediately goes back to his native Gotham City and vows to become the king of the Gotham docks. But Batman and the Flash put him on ice. I guess they wreck the little fetish or totem that the chief of the Islanders give him, and that makes him vulnerable long enough for Batman and the Flash to round him up. So that's more or less how Brave and the Bold number 81 went down. But then we pick back up with Bork here. This story is told. It's kind of nested flashbacks here. Some of the framing device takes place only 2 years ago. The rest of it takes place. 1 year ago. The rest of it takes place 8 years ago. I guess we can assume that his original encounter with Batman and the Flash took place 10 or more years ago, because 8 years ago, in flashback, we see Bork after having been an inmate for a significant amount of time. And we learn that apparently whatever juju the chief of Desolation Island laid on him did not actually dissipate completely after the Flash broke his little magic charm. It stayed with him, it came back to him, it made him strong and invulnerable again, but it continued to strengthen and toughen him until he actually kind of mutated into something not quite human. He begins to, his features become more primitive, he develops a pronounced underbite and begins to sprout tusks. He's not very attractive. But then we join up with him one random day when he's lifting weights out in the prison courtyard and decides, apparently on a whim, to just throw those weights through the prison walls, breaking them open, and runs to his freedom. He manages to escape despite an encounter with Batman and the Flash again, back to his mother's house in Newark. And old Mama Bork is Yeah, she's a tough old bird. She's probably the most enjoyable part of this whole story, actually. Bork wants to, take her away from her humble existence in one of, quote, the old neighborhoods of Newark, to go to a private island or something someplace, and she just says, I will go no such place with you. You turn yourself in, you bad boy, and she scolds him, and then, when the police arrive and surround the house, she suffers a heart attack. And poor Bork, he's human after all. He has a soft spot for his mother, and he desperately wants to get her some medical care, so Batman shows up and promises him, look, if you'll just turn yourself over to the police, I will do it. The Flash will whisk her away to a hospital in seconds. I have wealthy connections, the Wayne Foundation. I'll see to it that she gets the best care. I don't like to see anyone's parents die. Great characterization right there. So Bork, acquiesces, of course, because he loves his mom. And the Flash takes her away to the hospital. She lives. She gets better. All is well there. And Bork goes quietly with the police. And that takes us back to, the subjective present of this story, which is 1 year ago, by which point Bork has mutated still further, and now he's basically a big, gross, snaggle-toothed ogre, like a mutant human hippopotamus. Just picture Kilowog of the Green Lantern Corps after a bath in some acid, and that's about what he looks like. So, and he leaves prison, having served his sentence, paid his debt to society, vowing to go straight and use his powers for something constructive. He actually, a couple of his cellmates would try to clue him into some henchman work that's waiting for him outside if he wants it, and he just bashes their heads into a wall, swearing that he's going to go straight from now on. And the story ends with him just kind of walking out of prison and down a lonesome road, not knowing where he's going to go and what he's going to do. So there you go, a return to DC Universe relevance of a kind of cult favorite character from one of those sublimely silly Bob Haney creations of the late 60s. And apparently, in Busiek's endnotes on this issue, he reveals that in his original idea for the Power Company, back in the 80s, Bork was supposed to be an original character called Man-Monster Mahaffey, who's kind of a magically empowered, superhumanly tough, strong guy who's got a tough but fair mom at home who wants him to go straight. And so Busiek thought about using that character, but the name seemed a bit redundant with another character he had in mind to use called Manhunter, whom we'll get to in a second. And besides, he wanted some more connections, more ties to the DCU, more pre-existing characters. So this is what he decides to go with. I mean, Kurt, I love you, but if you want more pre-existing character, if you want more ties to the DC Universe, this was the best-known pre-existing character you could find. Bork. A obscure one-off palooka villain from a cult favorite Brave and the Bold issue from the late 60s? And mutated beyond recognition into a hippo man to boot? I mean, okay, Kurt. Not really achieving your goal there if you're trying to tie this in more to the DCU so that fans will give more of a hoot. But anyway, I kind of appreciate it. I had not heard of Bork before Power Company came along, and I still haven't read Brave and the Bold number 81, but I probably will someday. And Bork turned out to be a pretty cool and interesting character. Oh, and one final note. In the credit box, special thanks are given to Rick Remender. I find myself burning with curiosity now to know what exactly Rick Remender did to merit such special thanks in the production of this special Bork issue. So, moving on from Bork, we go to the other semi-familiar face in the Power Company cast, and that is, as I mentioned a minute ago, Manhunter. And which Manhunter, you may ask, since there are so many, and this is a legacy character? Well, it's kind of a new character and kind of anything but. This issue was, the artwork here is by Dan Jurgens and Bob Layton, so that's real Power Company power couple right there. But it's also very much an homage to Walt Simonson in his artwork, because this is, in fact, well, it's not the Paul Kirk Manhunter as seen in the classic Manhunter strip that appeared in Detective Comics back in the 70s, written by the late Archie Goodwin, and with art by Walt Simonson. Instead, it's, well, those of you who've read that story may remember that it kind of turned on Paul Kirk coming out of cryogenic suspension, a time he spent in the clutches of a mysterious international cabal called the Council, who, while he was out, had taken cell samples from him and used them to create an army of Paul Kirk clones that they had planned to train into their own private army to potentially overrun the world. And Paul Kirk, of course, rebelled at this notion and set about bringing the council down with a little help from the superhero community. And so they did, and many of the clones created there were destroyed, and the few that got away were being hunted down by friends and associates of Paul Kirk's. But one of them, who showed unusual autonomy and free ambition, during one of the final skirmishes between Kirk and his gang of clones, one of these clones just kind of slipped away from the action, didn't want any part of what was going on, just stole a trench coat off a wash line and ran away into the shadows, and was not seen for quite a long time thereafter. And then we kind of flash forward to the setting of this story, which is 2 years ago, quote-unquote, which lands us sometime in the 90s, I guess. And our guest star for this issue is Nightwing, who is wearing one of his 90s costumes with the yellow accents. And he rolls into Kenya, which is where this Manhunter clone has set up shop in the time between the events of the old Manhunter strip and 2 years ago, and Nightwing is in town on the trail of some stolen Soviet plutonium, which has been hijacked, and some bad guys are planning to market it off to terrorists or something. So Nightwing rolls into the port city of Malindi, Kenya, and he is determined to hunt down this fellow who has named himself Kirk DePaul, because Dick has learned that this DePaul person has got his fingers in a lot of pies, and he's kind of the go-to mercenary for anybody who needs something shady done in and around the nation of Kenya. So he's convinced that this DePaul, if he isn't directly involved in the plutonium theft, he'll know something about it. He tracks DePaul down once, DePaul shakes him off, so they kind of dance the violent dance a bit. They cat and mouse it around Malindi for a while. Eventually, Nightwing goads him into donning his costume, which is more or less the Simonson-designed 70s Manhunter costume, except per Walt Simonson's specific request, because Busiek ran this whole thing by Simonson first, out of respect for the man's work, for which I have respect of my own for Busiek for doing that. Simonson said it was okay for him to use a Manhunter clone as a character, and to use the costume design. All Simonson asked was that they not use the color red as part of the color scheme, to distinguish it from the Paul Kirk, I guess. And Busiek and the art team were only too happy to oblige. So Manhunter, this Kirk DePaul, battles Nightwing in a version of the costume that's basically the same, but it's black and white, no red and also no blue, and more basic buccaneer boots instead of the more elaborate shin scaffolding that Simonson drew on the character. Check out his artwork from that old Manhunter series, and you'll know what I mean. So yeah, the two of them battle it out, and eventually it comes to light that DePaul was in fact involved in the plutonium theft. He had contracted to deliver the plutonium to a bad guy that's going to take it offshore and out to sea to a potential buyer. And Manhunter makes good on that contract, but then, as soon as he's been paid, he spirits the plutonium away. Don't ask me how, because he doesn't have superhuman strength, and there's several large crates of plutonium there, and he is waiting there on a pier at Malindi for Nightwing, and he says, just take this stuff and deliver it to the authorities. So it would seem that our boy Dick Grayson had a positive effect on this largely cynical and amoral Manhunter clone, this man living a life borrowed from another. A man in deep denial about his connection and possible sublimated devotion to his genetic sire's life and value system. But Grayson, needles him, prods him, calls him some bad names along the way, and I guess wakes something up in him, because he kind of has a change of heart in the course of this story. Nightwing maneuvers him into confronting certain suppressed aspects of his identity and morality, something left over from the man that Paul Kirk was. And so it kind of helps him along a bit on his hero journey, even as Batman did for Paul Kirk years earlier. So the two of them walk away from each other, each of which having a somewhat different and better opinion of Kirk DePaul than he had when the story began. And sooner or later he also finds his way into the power company, where his function, according to Kurt Busiek himself, in the power company team dynamic will be the skill-based mercenary professional. Quote, someone so cold and pragmatic that he'd naturally clash with the idealistic Skyrocket. And we see a little bit of that even in that preview story at the back of Jla Number 61. And finally, the last member of the cast, and the only true ingenue in the whole bunch, the only character who just gained her powers and became a superhuman agent shortly before the events that will be seen in Power Company Ongoing Number 1. The last of the one-shots featuring Sapphire by Kurt Busiek, Mark Bagley, Keith Champagne, and Mark Farmer. A couple of great inkers there. Guest starring the JLA. And this story is set 3 days ago. No, 0 years, just 3 days. And it introduces us to a young teenager named Candy Gennaro. She's a teenage runaway, and she's been bumming it around the United States by bus for weeks or months now. She rolls into San Diego, California, for no other reason because the weather is nice there, and she's been cold a little too often in the last few weeks. And she gets off the bus in San Diego just in time to step out into the middle of a holy war between rival factions of the Cobra, with a K, cult. Those who are devoted to the original Cobra, Naja Naja, born Jeffrey Burr, and those who are devoted to his former consort, the mysterious Lady Eve, who claims that she is the true Snake Messiah. So these two different snake cults are duking it out and turning downtown San Diego into a war zone, and Candy, of course, takes to her heels to get away from all of that, and also to get away from the coffee stall proprietor from whom she has purloined a little lump of olive loaf to eat for lunch. And the award for most dramatic use of olive loaf in a comic script goes to Kurt Busiek. Statuette's in the mail, buddy. Okay, so anyway, Candy runs away from the Holy War and from the guy trying to chase her down for shoplifting. She finds her way to the San Diego waterfront, where, of course, she happens to fall right through a conveniently open hatch in the Sea Serpent, which is the enormous, super high-tech stealth submarine flagship of Lord Cobra himself. And so and of course it's just so well-armored and so well-guarded and so cleverly concealed that a random teenager can just fall right through an open hatch. Sure, why not? But once inside, then she bears witness to Lord Cobra being presented by his underlings with a prize, with a power object that is the whole reason why Cobra and his group are present in San Diego in the first place. It's a MacGuffin called the Serpent's Egg, which Cobra's agents stole from the Kurtzberg Gallery. That's a little homage there from Busiek, making reference to Kurtzberg as in Jacob Kurtzberg, which is the birth name of Jack Kirby, who was the man who kind of sort of created the character of Cobra. He was, Kirby had just left kind of a rough sketch and some notes and I think maybe even like almost a whole comic book's worth of material behind for Cobra, which DC then drug out of the drawer a couple years after Kirby had left in the wake of his Fourth World period at DC, and they handed it over to writer Marty Pasco to basically make a completely different comic book out of it from what Kirby had in mind. And so it's a little problematic to call Cobra a Kirby creation, but he at least contributed something to the character's beginnings, and it's to that, with the best of intentions, that Busiek makes a nod here when he refers to the Kurtzberg Gallery. And the Serpent Egg, stolen from the Kurtzberg Gallery, resembles a large cabochon gemstone about the size of an emu's egg, but it's not really a gemstone. It's an alien artifact with mysterious powers that Cobra wants for his very own. So, of course, once he's got this thing in hand, he just kind of sticks it on a pedestal, and he and his underlings leave the room to go, batten down the hatches and prepare to leave. And they leave it there completely unguarded so that this random little teenage ragamuffin can emerge from the shadows, and she, of course, makes a beeline for the Serpent's Egg. She heard enough about what powers it possesses for her to, be willing to gamble that if she grabs it, it'll give her the power she needs to make good her escape from this nightmare she's living. And no sooner does she touch it when it bonds to her. And it bonds to the flesh of the palm of her hand. And it immediately turns liquid and it flows all over her body, encasing her in living crystalline armor. So she becomes, for the first time, Sapphire. And of course she panics a little bit, but she keeps enough of her wits about her to realize that this new power of hers is, well, for one thing, she's attacked by Cobra's goons, and the laser blasts don't hurt her in the slightest. And then she learns that she can fly, So she flies, she hides herself up in the rafters, as it were, of the corridors of the submarine. Finally, she learns that she can use the serpent egg to interface with the onboard computers of this submarine she's on, lowering its defenses and also sending out a distress signal which summons the JLA, who had already been in San Diego to put down the Cobra gang wars. They find the sea serpent, they haul it topside, and they start battling Cobra's henchmen. And in the ensuing chaos, Candy scarpers, and she flies back to San Diego. She's overjoyed and exhilarated that she's gotten out of this with her crystalline skin intact, but then she hears a radio report that Cobra himself has escaped. He's still out there, and of course Candy realizes that he wants that serpent egg for himself, the very egg that has bonded to Candy's body, and that will never, to quote that, or to paraphrase the MGM Wizard of Oz movie, will never come off of her as long as she's alive. So then she's just kind of frozen in icy dread, and she's thinking to herself as the issue comes to an end, where can I run? Where can I hide? Because she's a marked woman now, and there's a supervillain on her tail. And the answer, of course, she runs to and hides with the power company, who take her in off the street because their headquarters ultimately is founded in the Trocadero building in San Diego. And so she becomes one of their junior agents, not really a partner yet, but she joins up with them, and I guess all's well that ends well for her. So there you go. Sapphire, the last of the 7 cast members of the power company that these Power Surge one-shots were meant to introduce us to. And this one-shot also establishes Cobra as a potential future antagonist for the power company, which, if I recall correctly, was paid off in the series itself. So, yeah, there's your setup. One preview, and one 14-page preview, and seven issues, about 140 pages of story, bearing a collective cover price of $17.50, $2.50 a pop. And that's kind of expecting a lot for readers to support for a completely untested superhero team concept featuring almost entirely unknown characters. And Music really is put a lot of weight on those 7 one-shots to introduce the characters when he really should have done a little bit more in the preview story. I mean, it worked on me. I mean, I obviously bought all 7 of these because I'm talking about them to you, but I'm quite sure a lot of other people did not, because I have come across these Power Surge one-shots in a lot of cheap bins at conventions over the years. So, there you are. However effective or not the setup was, there were some good stories with some good writing and some very good art to be found in these stories. I actually do kind of recommend them to fans of DC Universe character and texture, and especially if you plan to ever pick up the Power Company in back issue form. This is good preliminary reading. So I don't feel that very many people did said reading back in 2002. It's all kind of a moot point now. It's all water long under the bridge, and I'm pretty darn sure that I have talked more about this Power Surge event in the last however many minutes of recording time than has been said in the past 20 years. But there you have it. It's the Power Company series. I will return to Power Company number 1. I won't go into it in quite the same length that I've talked about these 7 one-shots, but I feel that it needs at least a nod. And so I'll talk a little bit more about the series concept and why it failed, or why I feel, in hindsight, it failed to catch on, because after all, it lasted a mere 18 issues before its too brief candle was snuffed. Okay, one more for the road here, folks. One more comic of 2002. A Marvel book this time. I promise it's just a single comic this time, and not a whole pull list. It like the Power Company, it's another newish superhero team that didn't quite get itself off the ground, and that is Citizen V and the V Battalion. Yes, we're looking here at a miniseries entitled Citizen V and the V Battalion, The Everlasting, number 1 of 4. It was written by Fabian Nicieza, with pencils by Louis LaRosa and inks by Jim Royal. And the rest of the creative team, I'm afraid, remains obscure, because, well, I'm sure I could find this out online, but looking at the credits box, I can just sort of make out Richard Starkings and Comicraft letters, but everything else below that it's kind of like the crawl at the beginning of a Star Wars movie, as the lettering kind of fades upwards towards the top of the screen, except it's fading away towards the bottom. The lettering is just so small and so faint as to be completely illegible, and that's, to be frank, a little bit disgraceful. It really should not happen in a contemporary comic book, but here we are. This is actually the second and final attempt to drum up interest in the V Battalion as a spin-off property. The characters were introduced as a team, they were introduced, I should say, in the Thunderbolts. Citizen V, after all, being the identity assumed, or perhaps usurped is a better word, by Baron Helmut Zemo as part of his Thunderbolts stratagem for his Masters of Evil. But the rightful inheritor of the Citizen V identity, John Watkins III, grandson of the original Golden Age Citizen V, eventually came back and reclaimed the costume and the identity from Zemo. And he is the main character of the miniseries of which I speak here. They had tried once before to spin Citizen V and the V Battalion off into a miniseries, which I think I may have mentioned on the Time Bubble at an earlier time. That was a 3-issue miniseries, and it came to a close in August of 2001, 7 months before the publication of the first issue of this one. Now, the V Battalion concept, as put forth by Nicieza and his collaborators here, is very much a matter of legacy, which was kind of a safe bet most of the time in comics of the time. Certainly it's something that DC had parlayed into great success with its JSA series back then. And it's kind of obvious to see that that's sort of what Marvel was going for in allowing this to be spun out into its own couple of tryout miniseries here, though it never quite caught on the way JSA did. But it's tinkering with the legacies of World War II era characters. And I stopped myself a little short of saying Golden Age characters because relatively few of the members of the cast actually have anything to do with authentic Golden Age, timely comics characters. Timely, of course, being the forebear of the modern Marvel comics that was active back in the 40s. As a matter of fact, the V Battalion actually has the most to offer fans of the 70s Invaders series, as written by Roy Thomas. Every member of the core controlling group of the V Battalion, known as the Penance Council, has some connection to that team and that series, including a character who had died shortly before this miniseries began, Helmut Gruller, the Iron Cross. Just to run them down here, the members of the Penance Council are Roger Aubrey, who was an associate of the Invaders. He was active for a time in the identity of the Mighty Destroyer. He was a close friend and confidant, traveling companion, and eventually we learn lover of Brian Falsworth, who was the second Union Jack. Union Jack being also a character created in the 70s by Roy Thomas and planted retroactively back in the 40s. So not an authentic Golden Age character, but active during the fictionally framed 1940s of the Marvel Universe. We have Betty Barstow, an actual Golden Age costumed adventurer called the Silver Scorpion, whom Roy Thomas used in a 90s Invaders miniseries. And she's shown here as slowly succumbing to Alzheimer's disease. Fred Davis Jr., who is the second Bucky, who took over in the role after the original Bucky, James Buchanan Barnes, died his tragic death, or appeared to, flying that drone plane over the English Channel. And he was the Bucky to the second Captain America, and he was introduced by Roy Thomas, again, as part of the... I think it's part of the tryout series for the Liberty Legion in Marvel Premiere, and ensconced as an official Bucky in a What If story. what if the invaders remained active after World War II, I think it was. And then that's what introduced the chain of legacy for the various Captains America after Steve Rogers disappeared. So he's present as well. Then we have Robert Frank Jr., Nuclo, who was a one-time Avengers foe and the biological son of two other Golden Age timely characters, members of the All-Winners Squad, and the Liberty Legion, and I guess honorary invaders, too. He was a mutant nuclear powerhouse with the mind of a 10-year-old. Then we have the granddaughter of Golden Girl and the grandson of the Human Top, who were two characters that Roy Thomas introduced, again, in the Invaders, for the sake of ethnic diversity. The original Golden Girl was Japanese-American, and the original Human Top, no relation to the Silver Age villain of the same name, was African-American, and they were brought in as members of, I think they were called the Kid Commandos, as kind of like a youth annex of the Invaders. So these are characters that are not really from the Golden Age, but they are characters that are at least related to characters whose recorded adventures were set at wartime, most of them written by Roy Thomas, some of them written by Don Glutt, I guess. It was Roy's understudy on some of his 70s projects back in the day. So yeah, if you're a fan of that era of Marvel storytelling, which I certainly am, then there might be some things of interest for you in the two Citizen V and the V Battalion miniseries that Marvel published. The first issue of this one, subtitled The Everlasting, actually begins with a flashback to days of yore. The first 8 pages are a prologue set in 1953, where we finally see the funeral for the aforementioned Brian Falsworth, the second Union Jack. The first one was his father, Lord James Montgomery Falsworth, who was active as a hero during World War I, again via Roy Thomas retcon. He was a member of a team of World War I era costume champions called Freedom's Five. And he actually, elderly as he was, even during World War II, tried to get back into costume as Union Jack and serve the United Kingdom, but couldn't. He was just too old and frail. So his son, Brian, stepped in the pages of the Invaders series, and he became the second Union Jack and fought with the team through the rest of the Invaders run. But then, sometime in 1981, to be precise, it was revealed again by retcon off-panel that Brian Falsworth had died in a car crash circa 1953. This was in the Roger Stern and John Byrne Captain America run, a favorite of my departed colleague Jamie D. And Stern and Byrne wanted to introduce a younger, more contemporary version of the Union Jack character, so poor Brian had to go. He had only existed in the comics for 5 years real-time. He'd been introduced in 1976 in The Invaders, and then 1981, we were told that he had died back in the 50s in a car accident. The writer's favorite disposal system for inconvenient characters. So here he finally gets a funeral in the opening pages of this issue of Citizen V and the V Battalion, The Everlasting Number 1. We can see some of his fellow Golden Age adventurers in the background, some of his teammates from the Liberty Legion, Whizzer, Miss America, Blue Diamond, the Thin Man, a few others. Namor is there. And his widow, also a member of the Invaders, Jackie Falsworth, his sister, well, not his widow, excuse me, his sister, definitely not his widow. His closest thing to a widow he has is Roger Aubrey, who was his friend, companion, and lover for years. The two of them were in the trenches of World War II, and Aubrey actually took on Brian Falsworth's first identity as the Destroyer and went out and fought some Nazis in that identity. And so he is the one who's hit hardest by the loss of Brian. Even though Brian's sister, Jacqueline, a.k.a. Spitfire of the Invaders, is also present. His father, Lord Falsworth, the original Union Jack, is there in a wheelchair. But Roger, I think, misses him the most keenly. And at the funeral, it's the death of Brian Falsworth that kind of triggers something inside of Roger. We're told that the V Battalion... Well, this is another thing worthy of mention. The V Battalion and the original Citizen V are also authentic Golden Age concepts. They first appeared in Daring Mystery Comics from Timely back in the 40s. And the original Citizen V, John Watkins, was a costumed adventurer who actually did the whole Masked Champion of Justice bit fully in the European theater of war, behind enemy lines. He wasn't just on the home front beating up on spies and saboteurs and whatnot. He actually took the fight to the Hun, as it were. And the V Battalion were his support team. These are actual concepts that appeared in Golden Age timely comics. So we're told that after the war, the V Battalion, after the original Citizen V, John Watkins I, died in action. The V Battalion soldiered on in his name into the early 50s as, basically a corps of Nazi hunters, just tracking down war criminals and Third Reich scientists wherever they had scattered throughout the world and bringing them to justice. But as at the funeral of Brian Falsworth, Roger Aubrey begins to feel that life is too fleeting and they're not making enough of a difference with the V Battalion. It's about time that they started thinking about the future. And so here we go. This is the turning point then in 1953 when the V Battalion ceased to be just a combat unit from World War II and ceased to be post-war Nazi hunters and became something more, and here's a dreaded word I'm about to utter, proactive. Because it's very often superhero team comics, with the best of intentions and pie-in-the-sky ideals. Creators announce that this team of superheroes is going to be different. They're going to be more proactive, and it's been tried several times, and it's just about always the kiss of death. Just as the V Battalion becomes more proactive, it also makes their general mission, their raison d'etre, less intelligible and less relatable. It makes their mission and modus operandi too nebulous. So it is when you read adventures of this team set in the present, such as their appearances in the Thunderbolts and in these two miniseries of theirs, it's kind of a little difficult to understand exactly what it is they do and to what kind of threats they respond. We're told that they've been acting behind the scenes for decades, and their existence was only revealed to the world when they were used in the Thunderbolts, i.e. in their first appearance in the modern incarnation of the group. The Penance Council, whose membership I outlined to you a few minutes ago, when they're shown on panel, they seem to spend most of their time just standing around on the bridge of their massive flagship. It's like the Shield Helicarrier Light. They call it the Vanguard. And they seem to spend most of their time standing around on the bridge of the Vanguard, wearing their fancy acolyte robe, Penance Council uniforms, snapping at each other and not doing much of anything else. The only member of the group that seems to actually get out there in the field most of the time, I mean, we have seen the other members of the Penance Council mobilize in their appearances in the Thunderbolts, but in these miniseries, they seem to just kind of stand around and let young John Watkins III, grandson of the original Citizen V and current holder of the mantle, he's the main field agent. They send him out there with his cloak and his sword and his V-shaped glider to do most of the dirty work. So it's not a very interesting premise that we've got going on here. There's lots of interesting characters. There's certainly a ton of potential, but it never quite slots itself into the more accepted modes of superhero action, and I think that's one very important reason why it never really succeeded in catching on with readers. And I guess we can blame it all on poor Roger Aubrey and his grief and frustration at the death of his lover, that he sets the V Battalion on this different and less identifiably superheroic path that the organization subsequently took. Still in 1953, though, in this opening sequence, we see the ex-lover of the original Citizen V. Her name is Paulette Brzee, codenamed the She-Wolf. She became Citizen V in the wake of John Watkins' death. We're told here that she's already given birth to John Watkins II, who would eventually become Citizen V also, and he would also in turn sire John Watkins III, the modern-day Citizen V, about whom this miniseries technically is. We see Paulette Brzee tracking down a Nazi scientist in Buenos Aires, and she's just about to bring him into justice. He's coming quietly with her when he is suddenly shot in the back by a mysterious assailant, dressed in red and purple desert garb. He calls himself Akhat, A-Q-H-A-T. He's named himself after a figure of Middle Eastern folklore. He wields a bow and strange, supernaturally charged black arrows that, when shot into the flesh of a victim, drain said victim's life force, and also the contents of his or her mind, making them utilizable and exploitable by Akkat himself. So he's able to absorb all the memories of this Nazi scientist he's just killed, and also sucks in his life force. Paulette Prezzi springs into action, gets the drop on him, and brings him to bear, and brings him to ground. And just before she shoots him in the head, Akkat's last words are, "Not even death can stop the everlasting." And from there, Nicieza hurls us forward in time to the present day, where we see John Watkins III, the current Citizen V, in full red, white, and blue regalia, his fencing saber in hand, and he too is holding Akkat at bay. The same guy whom his grandmother killed back in 1953, he has now brought down in Bosnia. The two of them are both there to be on opposite sides of a conflict involving cameo guest villains, the Flag Smasher and his group Ultimatum, whom many of you may have heard of from the recent Falcon and the Winter Soldier Disney Plus miniseries. This is the comic book version of these characters, though, and Ultimatum is much less ambiguously a terrorist organization. I mean, it's not a bunch of idealistic young refugees and expatriates just wanting to unite the world. The aim is the same, but the membership of the group are a bunch of jackbooted thugs wearing berets and balaclavas, and Flag Smasher is a middle-aged man. So, but anyway, they're only in the story for like 3 panels. The idea here is that they're expecting an arms shipment. Citizen V is here to bollocks that whole deal, whereas Akkat is there to facilitate it. And it turns out that the munitions that are the MacGuffin of this story come from Oracle Inc., which is the corporation founded by Marvel Golden Age character Namor the Submariner, which was then left in the hands of another Marvel Golden Age character, Jim Hammond. And by the end of this 4-issue miniseries, Hammond, the original Human Torch, comes on. He's brought on as like the new head of the Penance Council. It's an attempt on the behalf of the creative team to bring a more recognizable, better-known Marvel Golden Ager into the cast of characters, and maybe get some of the readers to care about the V Battalion a little more. All too little, too late. And that's really pretty much the only reason why Oracle Inc. is implicated as the supplier of munitions to Ultimatum. So anyway, Citizen V and Akkat have their little battle. Citizen V gets the upper hand, but then Akkat curses at him and says, "You will die for this! If not in this life, then my next!" So apparently immortality and or reincarnation is on the table, which would sort of help to explain how the current Citizen V can be fighting a guy that his grandmother had murdered a half a century earlier. So anyway, Akkat magically teleports himself away, but not before he's tagged with a tracer device by Citizen V. And then much of the rest of the issue is given over to internal drama on board the Vanguard. It's courtesy of the story's narrator/prisoner, Andrea Sturman, a character created by Nicieza. She's a holdover from Nicieza's 90s run on Nomad. She's a psychologist and author specializing in superhuman psychology, and she's also a super Stockholm Syndrome sufferer because she got herself aboard the Vanguard trying to get the inside dirt on this mysterious V Battalion, and once she knew too much, she was politely informed that she knew that she would not be allowed to leave the Vanguard again. So she's our narrator/prisoner, and she's totally into it, though, because she tells us that she's just so thrilled to get a front row seat for all of this superhuman angst and slowly fermenting conflict and melodrama. She observes the character flaws of the different members of the Penance Council, like poor Betty Barstow, the Silver Scorpion, who's slowly surrendering to the mind-destroying effects of Alzheimer's, which is tragic, and the clinical depression of Roger Aubrey, who has now lived half a century without his lover, and has not come any closer to succeeding in the goal he set for himself at Brian's funeral, to rid the world of all kinds of superhuman strife and chaos and bringing about world peace and order, which is a fool's paradise, although he has not allowed himself to see it as such until just recently. And the entire V Battalion is beginning to suffer and stagnate as a result of his leadership, which is part of the reason why Jim Hammond will be brought on as the new leader by the end of the story. So we see all of this unfolding through her eyes, and she lays it out for us in entertaining terms. But I have to point out also that relatively few of the potentially interesting cast of legacy characters that Nicieza and company have laid out here, relatively few of them even get a line of dialogue to say in this first issue of this miniseries. The last page of the issue, where the letters column ordinarily would be, is given over to outlining the dramatis personae, the different members of the Penance Council. We get a little fact sheet about each of them, complete with dramatic rhetorical questions. Like, will Darren's desire to experience the world conflict with his responsibilities to the V Battalion? I don't know, and I don't know why you bothered to ask the question, because it doesn't seem to be answered in the pages of this mini. And there's also kind of a breakdown of the organizational structure of the group, all the different specialist operations teams involved in the day-to-day operations of the battalion. Not that anyone asked. It's basically a page taken either from the original pitch or from the series Bible or something. Just something to fill space and fill in the reader and hopefully generate a little extra interest. I can't say that it doesn't seem to me like it would work very well. And, so the story, after the action in the first half and then some behind-the-scenes character melodrama between a relatively small number of members of the cast. In the second half, the vanguard finally catches up with Akat in Beijing. Citizen V is dispatched on his glider wing to see what's going on down there, and he reports back, great cliffhanger here, everyone in China is dead! Cue the soap opera organ. Not to give too much away here, but we do learn in the course of the rest of this 4-issue miniseries that the population of China is not quite dead. They've just been stricken with a death-like state. And the circumstances behind this are revealed to have something to do with a longtime Marvel Comics character who is a national hero / heroes of China. He's actually like 5 heroes in one. The Collective Man. He's loosely based on the old Chinese legend of the 5 talented brothers. And this mysterious seeming genocide of the Chinese people also has something to do with the mysterious power behind Akat, which is revealed to be the ancient Mesopotamian deity Marduk. So, yeah, there are a few interesting twists and turns left for this story to take as it wends its way towards its conclusion over the rest of its 4-issue run. So, there we are. That's Citizen V and the V Battalion, The Everlasting, which is kind of an ironic title for such a sadly short-lived concept. It's something, as I've said a couple times here, there was potential there, but it wasn't quite approached or elicited in exactly the right way. And ultimately, Citizen V and the V Battalion passed the torch of Golden Age legacy bearing to the New Invaders series, which debuted maybe 4 years after this miniseries saw print. There was a bit of a passing of the torch there, because a literal passing of the torch, because the Human Torch had become involved with the V Battalion by then, and he had to be brought over from the V Battalion to the cast of the New Invaders for that series to take place in accordance with the creator's wishes. And ultimately, it floundered and failed about as quickly as Citizen V and the V Battalion did, actually. So, there you are, 2 misfires on the part of Marvel to capitalize on its Golden Age history at a time when it really wanted to, there in the early to mid-2000s, in order to compete with DC and its very successful JSA series. So, I don't know what exactly to make of that in the grander sense of things. It does seem to me that, on the whole, historically, Marvel has not done quite as good a job at tapping its natural resource of Golden Age stories and characters than DC has. I mean, there's certainly been bright spots along the way. Roy Thomas, Frank Springer, and others. Classic 70s run on the Invaders comes to mind. Up against Citizen V and the V Battalion and the New Invaders, we had successes in the 2000s, such as the Marvels Project and the 12. But on the whole, Marvel just has not seemed to have done quite as good a job as DC. of managing their portfolio of Golden Age assets, as it were. And I say this with full knowledge that DC actually shoved the Justice Society into limbo for several years following the crisis. Even taking that into account, I still think DC's Golden Age and DC's attempts to revive same have come off better than Marvel's, because outside of the classic Marvel trinity of Cap, Namor, and the original Human Torch, most of what Marvel has done with their Golden Age timely concepts has not really stuck very well. So I'm willing to entertain comments and insights from those of you out there in Bubble Land on this subject, if you'd like. Do you believe that Marvel or DC have an inherently stronger Golden Age catalog of characters and stories? That one has a better Golden Age than the other? Do you agree that one of them has done a better job of managing said assets than the other? Or do you just not see this as a fruitful line of inquiry, and am I not making a valid point at all? This is also certainly a possibility. So just mull it over and let me know what you think in the usual CGS talkback avenues. But in any event, that's Citizen V and the V Battalion, the Everlasting for you. If you feel like checking it out, if I've made it sound appealing to you, if you happen to be a fan like me of Marvel's attempts at mining their own Golden Age legacies, try to find Citizen V and the V Battalion, the Everlasting. It's 4 issues. Just look for the gorgeous black and white pencil sketch covers that all 4 issues bear, all of them done by Mike Deodato Jr. It should stand out in your local cheap bin quite nicely. Be forewarned, though, that the interiors don't quite match the covers in the case of this miniseries, at least not for the first couple of issues here. Because I don't know much about Louis LaRosa, the penciler, or his body of work, but the pencils he turns in for this first issue, at least, are really pretty unappealing, at least for my taste. They look kind of squodgy and misshapen, kind of like all the figures he's drawing are crudely sculpted out of mud clay, and the heavy inks of Jim Royal are not doing the visuals any favors either. So it's artistically not that strong a miniseries, and by the 4th issue, neither Royal nor LaRosa are still doing any of the artwork. So it's usually a pretty good indication that something is not going right when an art team can't even last the course of a 4-issue miniseries. But in any event, on the story end of things, I do think that it is a miniseries worth checking out if, like me, you're into Marvel's Golden Age and latter-day revivals thereof. Okay, we're on the home stretch here, people. I just have a few tiny bubbles here for you. Just 4 of them, on a 2x2 format as well, as with the full-length reviews. 2 older back issues, 2 2002 back issues. First, I have Secret Origins, the 80s volume, number 23, cover dated February of 88, featuring the secret origins of the Floronic Man and the Guardians of the Universe. The Guardians story was written, not lettered, mind you, but written by Todd Klein, who, as of 1988, was serving in the capacity of DC's assistant production director, with artwork by Jonathan Peterson and Al Vey. And the Floronic Man story was written by Rick Veitch, who at that time was the writer of the Swamp Thing ongoing series, with art by British artist Brett Ewins. And how did we end up with a strange pairing of characters like Floronic Man and the Guardians of the Universe in this issue of Secret Origins? I have 1 word for you, friends: Millennium. And then I have 2 words for you: New Guardians. And then I have a guttural noise for you: ugh. And what am I grunting about, you ask? Try reading Millennium sometime, and I think you'll understand. Because Secret Origins 23 happens to be a bannered Millennium Week 6 crossover. Enough said about that. Then I have Beware the Creeper, number 3, a Silver Age back issue that I picked up at the same spot on the same day as I did the first appearance of Nightmaster, discussed earlier in this episode. And like the first appearance of Nightmaster, Creeper number 3 came out in 1968 and was written by Denny O'Neil under the pen name Sergius O'Shaughnessy. Although O'Neil does give himself a credit as special consultant in the credit box, probably just to deflect suspicion that he and O'Shaughnessy are one and the same. And the artwork is, of course, by the legendary Steve Ditko. And the plot involves the Creeper going into action to defend a village full of farmers and simple fisherfolk who dwell on an isolated, stormy island in the Atlantic, cut off from civilization since the early 1800s. So we've got kind of an M. Night Shyamalan's The Village situation going on here, except that a small group of criminals have discovered the island and have disguised themselves as supernatural warlords or something to victimize these poor people. So the Creeper has to intervene and do his own pseudo-supernatural spook act in order to rescue these villagers from the criminals' tender mercies. Silver Age classic there. Then, jumping back to 2002, I've got The Thunderbolts, issue number 60, which is part of the Heroes Return storyline in that title, which finds the Thunderbolts accidentally marooned on the Heroes Reborn reality, which by 2002 had been removed from that little blue ball that Franklin Richards kept it in and placed in geosynchronous orbit opposite Earth on the opposite side of the sun. It has become the new Counter-Earth. Not the original Counter-Earth, which the High Evolutionary created back in the 70s, as I'm sure a lot of you remember. That had been... That was gone by then. It had been abducted by aliens or something. So Heroes Reborn Earth becomes the new Counter-Earth, and in this story, written by Fabian Nicieza, with very nice-looking art by Pat Zurcher and Al Vey, the Thunderbolts have to find their way across the ruins of human civilization on this planet, which has been ravaged by natural and supernatural disasters since its god, Franklin Richards, abandoned it. It was also left to the tender mercies of Doctor Doom for a while. Now the denizens of Counter-Earth are fending for themselves, doing the best they can, and the Thunderbolts run afoul of the Heroes Reborn version of Baron Heinrich Zemo and his group of crypto-fascist crusaders called also the Thunderbolts, kind of an Earth 1, Earth 2 scenario, or maybe Earth 1, Earth 3 would be more appropriate. And the funny thing is, Zemo and his bunch are among the few groups trying to maintain law and order on Counter-Earth in the wake of its many reversals of fortune. So the Thunderbolts have to find their way in this strange new world. Meanwhile, back on regular Earth, Hawkeye has fallen in with a group of escaped supervillain convicts, and we also get a little bit of a sneak preview foreshadowing thing, a little mini scene leading into the aforementioned Citizen V and the V Battalion, the Everlasting miniseries. So more Thunderbolts fun. It's still one of the better things Marvel was putting out in the 2000s for my money. Absolutely, hands down. And finally, this one's going out to my friend and colleague Ian Levinstein. I've got Green Lantern, Volume 3, number 146, cover dated March 2002, by Judd Winnick, Jamal Igle, and Al Williamson. This is Kyle Goes Cosmic. That's right. This is part one of the Hand of God storyline, a 5-parter leading up to the milestone number 150 of this volume of Green Lantern. It's hot on the heels of issue number 145, in which Kyle, in battle with Effigy and some other baddies, dares to tap into, absorb, and assimilate the totality of the energy of the Green Lantern Corps, everything that was inside of the old giant power battery on Oa, and he goes beyond. He becomes something more than Green Lantern, something more than human. He becomes the cosmic being known as the Ion. And issue number 146 kind of explores the initial repercussions of this. He's come back to Earth. He has appeared before a little circle of friends, relatives, allies, and lovers, including his girlfriend Jade. And we see him in this issue kind of going about his business, trying to project an image of normality to those closest to him, while at the same time using his powers in strange and somewhat frightening new ways. I mean, he's using them to tap into the creative portions of his brain and pile up a pretty solid backlog of cartooning work for his gig at Feast magazine. But at the same time as he's doing that, he's also sending divergent selves of himself throughout time and space. He's foiling petty thefts and crimes all over the country. He's remediating famine in Uganda. He's single-handedly ending a civil war on an alien planet. And, worst of all, he's lying to his girlfriend Jade about his doing all of this while he is with her on a date and at home together with her after their date. Just ask Dr. Manhattan, Kyle Boy. This is a serious boyfriend don't. But yeah, this story is the beginning of some pretty big doings for Kyle, for the collected lore of the Green Lantern Corps, which gains a new lease on life by issue number 150, and also for just the DC universe as a whole, because as we'll see, the Ion is more than just an identity that Kyle assumes for himself on ascending to omniscient, omnipresent, near godhood. It's also kind of an entity unto itself, and it'll play into some important things to happen in DC Universe crossovers in the years following 2002. So there you go, Ian. This one's for you. Have a good flight, buddy. And that brings us to the end of yet another excursion together aboard the Time Bubble. I thank you all for coming along with me here. Please do return your seats to their upright and locked position before exiting the gangplank. I would like to assure you that it is my full intention here, and this is not just hot air, I am setting a goal for myself to record another one of these things before Memorial Day, which is when I have to disappear back to Stone Harbor and resume my more intensive summer work schedule. Before then, I hope to be back among you with another bundle of bubble babble for your enjoyment. In the meantime, I encourage you, as always, to visit the usual outlets for listener talkback here in Comic Geek Speak. You can go to the comic forum, thecomicforums.vanillacommunity.com, which is our forum site, or you can go to Facebook and go to our Comic Geek Speak supergroup, where there will be a talkback thread about this episode. Let me know if any of my ramblings here have sparked any specific recollections of yours about the comics I've discussed, or any related subjects to them. Tangents and vacillations are encouraged. And, of course, I introduced that topic about Marvel's handling of their Golden Age characters and stories, latter day versus DC's. If you think that's something worth discussing, please have at it. I encourage it. I'd like to hear what other people have to think about this, or have to say about this, because it's something that has occupied my thoughts over the past several days. So, thank you once again, folks. I hope you found our time together here over the past 3 hours somewhat edifying, or at least amusing. And I'll be with you again before too much longer. I'm giving you a loose-knit pie crust promise on it. And whenever the next time may be, I will, in fact, see you and speak to you next time.